Welcome to the next chapter of Betrayed and Broken, a husband's journey of revenge, heartbreak, and rising from the ashes. If you haven't yet experienced the first part of this emotional roller coaster, don't worry, we've provided the link below in the comments so you can catch up. This journey of pain, resilience, and the quest for justice is far from over, and we are thrilled to have you along for the ride. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and stay tuned for the upcoming chapters. You won't want to miss the twists and turns that lie ahead. Join us as we continue this tale of betrayal, heartbreak, and redemption. 15 years of marriage vanished in an instant. She left me for a wealthy doctor, believing she'd upgraded her life. But she didn't just leave. She took our daughter with her, betraying me twice over. I was expected to accept their departure without resistance, but they underestimated me. My revenge was swift, calculated, and brutal. I ensured their perfect little world crumbled, just as they had shattered mine. Now, they live in the ruins of their own making, while I rise from the ashes. This is my story. I shrugged. "You're right, Kim," I said, my voice steady. She looked at me with a worried expression. "Terry, tomorrow it's very likely that Carol will be in the courtroom as your lawyer. Can I suggest you stay as far away from her as you can? Your talks can get a bit heated." We both laughed. "Not a problem, Kim. If I don't need to speak to her, I won't." She stood up and headed toward the door but turned around before she left. "Terry," she began, her tone softening. "Thanks for looking out for me all those years. These days my attention is all on Paul and Candice. But with those nice girls your fiancé has, it's amusing to still feel noticed by my little brother." She beamed. I felt my cheeks warm up but chuckled. "Hey, that's what little brothers do." I quickly became serious. "But really, I couldn't ask for a better sister than you, Kim. I really care about you." "I know, Terry. I care about you too." The next day, at the appointed time, Dad, Kim, Melody, Harmony, and I sat in the courtroom gallery with a bunch of people I didn't know. We were all waiting for the hearing of Dr. Morrison. Technically, he was still a doctor at this point, but we all thought it wouldn't be long before the medical board took his title away. Today would tell us more. A few moments before the hearing began, a lawyer entered and took their place for the defendant. With them came Carol, who was dressed simply and looked unwell. She didn't glance at us, and we mostly ignored her as she sat right behind the defense. Dr. Morrison was brought in through a side door by security and sat next to his lawyers. I don't think he noticed me. He just stared at the floor. We all stood when the judge entered and sat down after calling the hearing to order. "This is an arraignment hearing for Dr. Stephen Morrison on charges of," he paused to check his notes, "assault with intent to cause harm and attempted murder against Mr. Terry Other. I also see here that you have previously verbally confronted Mr. Other twice before today. Is that correct, Dr. Morrison?" One of his lawyers spoke up. "Your Honor, on behalf of my client, I'd like to point out that neither of the past incidents is related to the current charges against Dr. Morrison." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Counsel, I see your last name is also Morrison. What is your relationship to the defendant?" "I'm his cousin, Your Honor," the lawyer replied. "Well, Mr. Morrison, even though you are family, I think you should review the evidence against your cousin before entering my courtroom. From what I read in my file leading up to this case, I viewed a concerning video where your cousin, Dr. Stephen Morrison, verbally attacked and then threatened Mr. Other's life. Have you not seen this video related to your client?" The lawyer tried to change the topic. "Your Honor, we asked after the incident that the video not be used in this case and paid the necessary fees to both the courts and the medical board. The video was not meant to be part of any evidence. I request that it be removed from this case or any future hearings." I glanced at Kim, who looked pleased with herself. At first, my dad had mentioned that I had taken the video when Carol Mackenzie and Stephen confronted me outside the cafe. Their legal team acted quickly. They seemed to have rushed to get a court order to keep the video from being used, and that's what the lawyer, who was also related to him, was talking about now. I made eye contact with Kim, and she signaled for me to pay attention. If they believed money could cover up what happened that day, they were very wrong. The judge looked amused. "Mr. Morrison, first, any order you think you had to hide your client's actions was not done legally and would never be allowed. After review, second, whatever money your client paid does not stop legal action when someone's life was at risk." The defense side of the room seemed to shrink. "Third, on a personal note, I have watched the video, and I am not impressed with your client or his family." The judge went on. "The video your client tried to hide supports what we are discussing today. That is, your client, Dr. Stephen Morrison, assaulted and tried to harm Mr. Terry Other. Does your client understand the charges?" he asked both men. The man and his cousin both looked nervous, and his cousin answered, "He does, Your Honor." "Good." The judge then looked at everyone else in the gallery. Is Mr. Terry Other here today? I stood up and responded, Yes, Your Honor, I am. Both Carol and the man turned to look at me for the first time. Carol looked surprised while the man looked angry. Mr. Other, the judge asked, Would you be willing to answer a few questions? My lawyer is here with me, Your Honor. I would be happy to answer questions. However, would it be okay if she came forward with me? I asked. The judge smiled. Of course, please come forward. Kim and I walked to the front of the courtroom and sat down in what would usually be where the prosecution sits. Kim leaned in close and told me that I should be honest and look at her if I needed help. Now, Mr. Other, this is just a simple hearing, and I'm hoping you can help me with a few details, the judge said, shuffling through some papers. He was looking at various reports about my connection with the Morrisons. Mr. Other, can you explain your relationship with the defendant? The judge asked. Sure. Dr. Morrison is married to my ex-wife, and he has adopted my daughter, Mackenzie, as his own. Other than 3 brief meetings, I have no relationship with him or my former family, nor do I want one, I said, feeling a bit shaky. This was hard. The last time I was in court was for my divorce, and I hadn't said a word. The judge turned to Mr. Other with a stern look, his voice firm as he asked, Do you still have contact with your ex-wife or daughter? Mr. Other paused for a moment before replying, No, Your Honor. Since the divorce, I've only seen Carol a few times, and those encounters were difficult for both of us. I've only seen Mackenzie a couple of times. The judge raised an eyebrow. So, would you say that you have no relationship with either your ex-wife or daughter? Correct, Your Honor, Mr. Other replied, shaking his head slowly. He took a deep breath before continuing. It was a hard blow, Your Honor. When I received the divorce papers, along with the adoption request from Mackenzie and the restraining order, it felt like they were saying I wasn't good enough either as a father, a husband, or a provider. Carol even wrote in her letter that I wasn't a good plumber. The judge nodded understandingly. I see. Can you explain why you recorded the video from the incident at Malin Cafe? Mr. Other straightened in his seat, his voice growing clearer as he spoke. Yes, Your Honor. I came back to town to visit my family after my mother was diagnosed with a rare bone cancer. I heard the gasps around the room, and he could see Carol's surprised expression. I wanted to get my parents some coffee and breakfast after her first treatment, so I stopped by Malin Central, which has the best coffee in town, he added, smiling as a few people in the courtroom nodded in agreement, familiar with the local coffee spot. As I was texting someone, he continued, Mackenzie confronted me. I tried to walk away to avoid making a scene, but Dr. Morrison decided to pursue the issue right there in the cafe. I could sense trouble brewing, so I decided to record the exchange, just in case I needed to protect myself later. The judge leaned forward, asking, Did you inform the other person involved or your family that you were filming them? No, Your Honor, Mr. Other responded, shaking his head. I was trying to avoid any trouble, and my lawyer later confirmed that filming in a public place is not illegal. The judge nodded thoughtfully. Understood. Now, Mr. Other, can you share how you felt when Dr. Morrison made the threat in the video? Mr. Other let out a deep sigh. Honestly, Your Honor, I wasn't worried. Dr. Morrison had been in a relationship with my then-wife for almost 2 years. It felt like they all wanted to hurt me as much as possible. I was angry, Your Honor, and let's just say, I'm in good shape. I work out at least twice a week. If it came to that, I could handle myself. The judge glanced at Dr. Morrison, who was sitting with a fierce expression on his face. So, you're not saying you were scared of the threat? Mr. Other chuckled. No, Your Honor. Dr. Morrison, he's the one who started the trouble. I never planned to engage with him, but if it came to that, I wouldn't just walk away. All right, the judge replied. Can you tell us what you were doing at the hospital that day? Mr. Other took a breath, his expression serious. I came into town after my mother went to the hospital with chest pains due to her cancer. While I was there, my sister had just had my niece, so I was moving between the cancer and maternity wards for a few days. On the day in question, Harmonione of my girlfriend's my mother, and I were walking to the maternity ward to assist my sister when Dr. Morrison attacked me. The judge's eyes widened, and he raised an eyebrow. One of your girlfriends, Mr. Other? Mr. Other blushed slightly, and the courtroom filled with stifled chuckles, except for Carol, Dr. Morrison, and his cousin who sat stone-faced. All right, the judge said with a smirk. Putting your dating life aside, weren't you concerned being at the hospital where Dr. Morrison worked? No, Your Honor, Mr. Other replied. I figured there was a chance I might run into him, but I never thought he'd actually go through with his threat. As a doctor, I expected him to follow the Hippocratic oath not to harm anyone. The judge nodded, looking sharply at Dr. Morrison. You are correct, Mr. Other, he said. You had no reason to be worried. He turned back to Mr. Other. Let's continue. Just a couple more questions. How are you feeling now after everything that happened? Mr. Other paused before answering. What happened to me was serious. I actually died twice in the emergency room. They told me I almost didn't make it a third time. I was unconscious for several days. I'm only here today because of my family and the excellent doctors at Maitland Hospital. He smiled slightly. I'm happy to say that I've fully recovered and have no lasting issues. The judge glanced at his papers before looking up at Mr. Other with a curious expression. One last question, Mr. Other. Earlier, you mentioned that your ex-wife and daughter left you because of your profession. Are you still a plumber? Yes, Your Honor, Mr. Other replied. I'm still a certified master plumber. The judge chuckled lightly. That's a very formal answer, Mr. Other. Let me rephrase. What do you do for work now? Mr. Other caught the judge's knowing look, sensing that the judge had some past experience that made him want to help. Well, today I work for Deoting Plies, as the National Quality Manager, handling both local and international products. The judge nodded, clearly impressed. That sounds much more impressive than just being a plumber. Thank you, Your Honor, Mr. Other replied with a smile. The judge dismissed him with a wave of his hand. That will be all. Thank you for your time, Mr. Other. As Mr. Other sat down beside his daughters, who each wrapped an arm around him, Carol watched him closely. The atmosphere in the room shifted as Dr. Morrison's lawyer started to speak, trying to defend his client by highlighting Dr. Morrison's community involvement, but it was clear that the judge wasn't buying it. At one point, the judge glanced over at Mr. Other and his daughters, his eyebrow raising in curiosity. Mr. Other couldn't help but smile back, though he quickly masked it. After a few moments of back and forth, the judge turned his attention back to the case at hand. Mr. Morrison, the judge said, his tone growing serious, given everything that has been said today, your client must understand the gravity of the evidence presented. How does your client plead? Your Honor, at the request of my client, I am entering a plea of not guilty, Dr. Morrison's cousin announced, his gaze shifting uncomfortably as he spoke, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. A heavy silence settled over the courtroom. Everyone had expected the usual, a guilty plea followed by a plea for leniency. I couldn't understand why Dr. Morrison still insisted on his innocence. My anger flared up, and I could feel Melody and Harmony's hands tightening around mine. Melody leaned in, planting a gentle kiss on my cheek. It's okay, love. Let it go. We're here for you, she whispered soothingly. I took a deep breath, trying to center myself as the judge, who had been silent until now, spoke. I must say, I'm a bit surprised, Mr. Morrison. The judge began, addressing Dr. Morrison. I will review all the evidence, and after today's hearing, I'll offer my recommendations for the trial. Bail for Dr. Morrison is set at $2.5 million. He will also be required to surrender his passport, wear a GPS tracking device, and check in with the corrections department once a week until the case is resolved. Based on what I've seen, I don't believe Dr. Morrison is a flight risk, nor is he likely to cause any further trouble. The judge turned his attention to Dr. Morrison. Do you understand and accept these conditions for your release? I want to hear you say it, not your lawyer. Dr. Morrison stumbled over his words. Yes, Your Honor, I accept and understand. The judge's gaze hardened. Good. Now, I have one last thing to discuss, Dr. Morrison. It concerns everything from the moment you began your involvement with Mr. Other's wife to where we are now. Are you listening? We all leaned in, eager to hear what was coming next. Dr. Morrison swallowed, clearly uncomfortable. Yes, Your Honor, I'm listening. The judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he glared at Dr. Morrison as though he were an unwelcome pest on his lawn. From what I've seen and heard today, I would typically issue a restraining order against you, one that would keep you at least 100 meters away from Mr. Other and his family. But I won't do that. Do you know why? No, Your Honor, Dr. Morrison answered nervously. The judge's lips curled into a smile, but it was a cold, unsettling smile. I won't do it because Mr. Other has proven he can handle you, even under pressure. He's made it clear he wants nothing to do with you. So if you see him, I suggest you turn around and walk away. Otherwise, you might find yourself in even deeper trouble. Dr. Morrison gulped, nodding quickly. He glanced at me, our eyes meeting briefly. I gave him a knowing wink but kept silent. The judge relaxed slightly, then added, I want to remind you, Dr. Morrison, that you have 90 days to change your plea. If I were you, I'd think long and hard about your decision. After those 90 days, a court date will be scheduled based on your plea. This session is now closed. We all stood as the judge left the room. Dr. Morrison, flanked by his two lawyers, was led out through a small door. His cousin Carol cast a lingering glance back at us before disappearing. Later, We sat together at a cafe just outside the courthouse, basking in the weak winter sun. It was a chilly afternoon, and a light breeze made the air feel sharper as we enjoyed a late lunch. Harmony turned to Kim. "So, how did we do?" "Pretty much as expected for your guy," Kim replied, her eyes meeting mine. "He did really well." "Yeah, he's good at that," Harmony said, as though everyone already knew that. I let out a frustrated sigh. I was really close to losing it when that jerk still insisted he wasn't guilty. "I know, honey," Melody murmured, "but you had us all worried." I leaned over and kissed her, then turned to kiss Harmony. "Thank you, my lovely ladies," I said with a grateful smile. "I have to admit, it felt good giving Carol a piece of my mind," I continued. "New life, new job, and I loved the look on everyone's faces when I mentioned my girlfriends." "You mean fiancés?" Harmony corrected. "Yes, fiancés," I replied, feeling a little sheepish. "Sorry, girls, still getting used to saying that, but soon you'll both be my wives." Melody giggled, and Harmony raised an eyebrow, looking at me with knowing eyes. I guess Carol was the woman sitting up front, looking like she was losing her mind while you spoke. "Yep, that's her," Kim answered for me. Harmony snorted. I didn't get a good look at her, but she really missed out. We all laughed, the tension of the morning slowly fading away. Then my phone buzzed. I glanced down at the screen and saw a message from Carol. "Terry, I know you don't want to talk, but I'd like to meet with you about some things. Can you come to the courthouse steps in 15 minutes? I frowned, and Melody noticed immediately. "What's wrong, babe?" she asked softly. I showed her the message, then passed it to Harmony and Kim. "Doesn't she get that I don't want to see her? I thought I made that clear earlier today," I muttered, feeling a familiar sense of frustration. "I know, honey," Harmony said gently, "but she might not be getting it. You should go talk to her, though. Stay calm, think of us if you need to, and remember, you can always walk away." Melody nodded in agreement. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to." I couldn't argue with them. They knew what I needed. I sighed and reluctantly agreed to meet her. A little later, I stood on the courthouse steps waiting for Carol. "Hi, Terry. You look good," she said awkwardly as she approached. "Carol," I replied, nodding without a hint of warmth. She seemed taken aback by my cool reception. "Come on, Terry. Is that all you have to say after 15 years? I know I hurt you, but it's been 2 years now. Your anger can't still be that strong." I stared at her, every memory of the past few years flashing in my mind. It all seemed carefully orchestrated, like it was always about money. My jaw clenched as I gave her a skeptical look. "Carol, how I feel about you doesn't matter," I said coldly. "You didn't ask me here to find out how I've been. Since you left, you haven't even bothered to check in on me. I never thought this conversation was about my feelings. So what do you really want?" Her eyes widened with surprise at my calm demeanor, but she quickly masked it, raising her hand to her chest as though wounded. "Terry, have I really been that cold?" She tried to look sad, but I didn't buy it. Almost as quickly, she switched the subject. "So, it sounds like you're dating again. Is it one of the girls I saw you with?" she asked. She didn't seem to realize how her question had sounded. The word girls hung in the air, and I felt my face harden. "Yes," I replied, my voice curt. She nodded absently, as if processing the information. "Well, that's good. And now you're a quality manager, not a plumber. That's a nice upgrade, right?" She mused, more to herself than to me. Her hands began to fidget, and I could see her unease. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "Carol, as I've said before, I'm not interested in sharing anything about my life with you. I had my chance to be happy, and with very few exceptions, I'm done with you." I paused for a moment and gestured toward the courthouse, wanting her to understand that everything that had come before was a storm cloud that still hovered over my life. "Why did you come here, Carol?" I asked, the words hanging in the air between us. She sighed heavily, as if the weight of her request had been building for some time. "Terry," she began, her voice low but steady, "we're struggling. We don't have money coming in. Stephen's trust barely covers the basics, and with his bail and parole, it's draining us dry. We have to get special permission just to manage it all." She looked up at me, her eyes pleading. I was hoping you'd reconsider giving me Mackenzie's university fund. We need it to make sure we have enough for everything." I stood frozen, staring at her in disbelief. It took a long moment, maybe longer than I wanted to admit, before she spoke again, but when she did, I was taken aback by how completely out of touch she seemed. Did she not understand the weight of what she was asking? "Terry," she repeated, her tone now a little more insistent. "With everything going on, I wondered if you might reconsider letting me have Mackenzie's university fund." I started to smile, almost out of disbelief. Carol saw my lips curl upward and thought for a moment that I was agreeing. But then, as my grin grew wider, hers faded. The smile that had once danced on her face turned into something more strained as I let out a sharp laugh. It wasn't a chuckle, was the kind of laughter that surprised even me. I laughed so hard my eyes filled with tears. Carol's face turned red with embarrassment, and I could see her frustration growing. I stopped laughing and walked her over to a wall near the courthouse. "Let me get this straight," I said, my voice low and deliberate. "Your horrible husband takes you from me, promises you a better life, convinces you to betray me, and adopts my daughter. He spins the same lies to her, and just like that, you both leave me without a single word of warning." I paused for effect, letting the silence between us hang heavy. "And then," I continued, my voice growing sharper, "he threatens me, tries to have me killed with your support, and now we're standing here. You're asking me for money, the person you wronged, the one you left behind, all for what? So you can buy more things you don't need? You think I owe you something?" She stood straighter, her shoulders tense, as she met my eyes with a look of defiance. "Well," she said, her voice tinged with pride, "I wouldn't put it exactly like that, but you get the idea. If not for me, then for Mackenzie. We have a lifestyle to maintain, and with Stephen unable to work because of you, we have to keep things going." I stared at her in disbelief. "Carol," I began, my voice colder now, "if you were anyone else, I'd say you were out of your mind. But you know better than anyone what this means." She smiled, thinking she had me, but I wasn't finished. "I know you, Carol," I said, my voice tight with anger. "From everything you've said in the last 2 years, it's clear to me that you're completely out of touch. When we were married, we made it work. We had enough to meet our needs every month. And now you're telling me that you can't survive on what your husband's trust gives you." I let out a frustrated sigh, shaking my head. "You're telling me you can't find a job?" She flinched at my words. "Yes," I said, "a job. Do you remember what it's like to actually work? Because it seems like you and Mackenzie don't want to work like the rest of us." I stepped closer, my voice now sharp and filled with disdain. "And the money you want from me, you don't deserve it. You didn't earn it." The anger inside me was bubbling up, but I tried to breathe through it. "And your so-called husband tried to kill me in a hospital," I added, my voice trembling with fury. "And now, you have the nerve to ask me for money so you can buy more things you don't need, so you can live a life you never earned." But just as I felt my blood boiling, a new thought struck me on that shifted everything. I took a deep breath and, with a slight smile, changed my approach. Carol looked at me, her face a mask of confusion, and I could see her starting to worry. "Carol," I said quietly, "do you know why Stephen hates me so much?" Her eyes flickered, and she lowered her gaze, just like the last time I confronted her. But this time, when she met my eyes again, I saw a different expression: curiosity. "No," she answered softly, almost hesitantly. "Stephen never really explained why, but he gets upset whenever Mackenzie or I mention you, especially in the mornings." I couldn't help but chuckle. "Carol," I said, leaning in a little closer, "you talk and move in your sleep." She tilted her head, clearly puzzled. "Of course I do. You've known that since high school. But what does that have to do with anything?" I smiled again, a slow, almost mocking smile. "When we were married, you used to share your dreams with me. Your not-so-great husband never heard them, but I did. You'd tell me about them in your sleep." She snapped at me, embarrassed, but I could see the way she was processing my words. "That doesn't explain why he—" She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes widening as she realized what I was getting at. I leaned in, speaking softly but deliberately. "You see, Carol, Stephen couldn't handle the truth. Because when you sleep, you dream of being with me again. You dream of us, of how things used to be. You miss it. You dream about me taking you back. And sometimes in those dreams, you touch yourself." Her face twisted with disbelief. "You do this so often," I continued, "that one night, when you were dreaming, Stephen heard you. And when he saw me in the hospital, it broke him. He couldn't take it anymore, so he tried to hurt me." I snapped my fingers in front of her face, watching her realization dawn. The horror on her face was almost satisfying. "Carol," I said quietly, my voice now a low, menacing whisper, "from the moment you left me, you've been empty. You keep dreaming of what we had. You miss Memmy touch, the way I made you feel. And Stephen, he knows. He knows you'll never be happy with him, and he's chasing a dream he'll never reach." She didn't say anything. She couldn't. The look on her face was a mix of pain, surprise, and something deeper: regret, perhaps, or guilt. I stepped back, finally feeling some peace. I'd said everything I needed to say. "No, Carol," I said, my voice final. "It's too late. You left me for a dream, and now those dreams are showing you how foolish you were. Go back to your lifeless marriage and think about everything you threw away." I turned and walked away, feeling the weight of the past finally lift from my shoulders. I didn't look back, because I didn't need to. A smile crept across my face. I hadn't given her a second thought for a while. My mood remained bright, lingering long after that day. My bond with the girls had only deepened, and we made remarkable progress with our wedding plans. Work was thriving as well, and I felt myself improving at my job at Dayot Inc. Then my birthday came, and the girls decided to treat me to a nice dinner. Afterward, we went to a nearby club to dance. It was obvious that the three of us were the center of attention, our energy, our vibe. It was like we belonged on the cover of a magazine. The girls were stunning in their matching green dresses, and I looked sharp in a navy blue suit they'd dressed me in, my hair perfectly styled. I felt like $1,000,000. As the night unfolded, a few guys approached me while the girls were in the bathroom, asking for drugs. The second guy who asked took me by surprise. I turned him down, and couldn't help but wonder what made him think I'd be the type to sell drugs. His response caught me off guard, but made me laugh. "You've got two gorgeous women with you tonight," he said, glancing at the girls. "They're only looking at you. We'd do anything just to get their attention. Plus, you're dressed well, so we just assumed." That moment, my confidence soared. I stood a little taller, my smile a bit wider. The rest of the night was full of laughter and dancing, not stopping until the early morning. When we got home, the girls took good care of me. We all ended up tangled in a cozy pile, falling asleep together. But then, my birthday passed without a word from Carol or Mackenzie, not even a text. No cards, nothing at all. I wasn't expecting much, though, just like previous years. A tiny glimmer of hope had formed after my last conversation with my former daughter, but I suppose that hope had disappeared too. When Mackenzie's birthday arrived a few days later, I decided to try reaching out. I still had the number she used to contact me during her mother's separation. It was a long shot, but I dialed it from my office after lunch. It went straight to voicemail. "Hi, Mackenzie, it's Dad. I guess it's just Terry now," I stammered into the phone, unsure of how to begin. "I know today's your birthday, and I just wanted to reach out. I hope we can rebuild our relationship after everything that's happened. We've all gone our separate ways, but I miss you. I miss the times we shared, and I miss spoiling you just a bit." I took a deep breath before continuing. "Anyway, happy birthday. I hope you have a fantastic day. Bye." I hung up and sat in silence for a moment, reflecting. Just as I was processing everything, Melody walked in. She sat down on my lap, gently wiping away a tear I hadn't even realized had fallen. "What's wrong, honey?" she asked, her concern evident. I didn't want to say much, but I explained, "I just called Mackenzie to wish her a happy birthday. I thought maybe it could help us talk again." Melody stroked my cheek, her voice soft. "Sweetie, you're such a wonderful man. After everything they've done to you, you still want to reach out to your daughter." Just then, my phone beeped. "See? That's probably Mackenzie thanking you for your message." I checked the message, but it wasn't what I expected at all. It was Mackenzie, and she wasn't thanking me. "Leave me alone. You put my father in jail. My mum is upset after talking to you, and now you want to act like you care about me. That's disgusting." I felt a sharp pain in my chest as I read her words. And then came another message. "If you really want to do something for my birthday, give me my college money so I can buy something nice for myself. Otherwise, just keep being a terrible dad." And then the final blow, the last message that shattered whatever was left of our relationship. "You know what? Don't give me anything for my birthday, like you haven't for the last few years. I'm old enough to sue you for it, and I will. Get ready, because I will take everything from you." I dropped my phone, my mind racing. Melody was still on my lap, but I didn't know what to say. What did I do, Melody? Why do I deserve such anger from my own child? For a moment, neither of us spoke. Melody then turned to me and said, "Terry, you haven't done anything wrong. That girl is filled with lies. She's been taught to think badly of you. Dr. Morrison is out on bail, so he's probably been saying awful things about you, and that's affecting how she feels." I nodded, taking comfort in the warmth of Melody's hand on my arm. She picked up my phone and dialed what I assumed was Mackenzie's number. After a few moments, I heard Melody's voice on the phone, but only her side of the conversation. "Hi, Miss Morrison. I just wanted to check if you sent those texts to Mr. Terry's phone a moment ago," Melody said, her tone calm but firm. She listened for a moment before responding. "I see. It doesn't matter who I am, Miss Morrison, but yes, I am with him right now." She paused again, and then her brow furrowed. "Okay, Miss Morrison, I'll let him know." and thank you for confirming it was you." Melody hung up the phone and turned to me. "I'm sorry, Terry, but your former daughter is really difficult." Her voice was sharper than usual, clearly upset. I lowered my head. "I know, Melody. This feels like the end between us. I had hoped we might fix things one day, but I guess that's not possible now." Melody wrapped her arms around me, her voice soft but filled with compassion. "I know our love," she said. "I see how hurt you are and how much you wanted to make things right." She leaned in and kissed me gently. "But if that hadn't happened, you wouldn't have met us." I smiled, touched by her words, and kissed her back. "I know, Melody. I guess we'll wait and see what happens next." A part of me couldn't help but think that my last conversation with Carol, or being in court with Stephen, had pushed things with Mackenzie. Melody nodded, her voice steady. "Of course, Terry. I'd bet on it." She sounded almost rehearsed when I spoke to her. "I'm angry with her for hurting you, but a small part of me feels sorry for her too." "I feel sorry for her," Melody said softly, her voice tinged with concern. "In a few years, Mackenzie might experience a lot of anger and regret, and she won't know how to deal with it. The real question is, are you prepared to be there for her when that time comes?" I paused for a moment, the weight of her words settling over me. "I don't know, Melody," I finally responded, the pain in my chest making it hard to form the words. "It's just too hard to think about Mackenzie right now. I'm not sure I could handle it if she showed up at my door one day, so I think it's time to put that chapter of my life to rest." I looked up at Melody, a forced smile creeping across my face. "But on a brighter note, I have two incredible women in my life, two women I love deeply, who I'm about to marry, and they both want to start a family with me." Melody's eyes sparkled, and she planted a kiss on my lips. "Wow, you really know how to make a girl happy," she teased, her lips lingering against mine for a moment. Just as we shared a quiet laugh, Salome assistant walked into the room, her curiosity piqued by the mention of kids. "What's all this talk about children?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Ah, Terry is just joking about making sure both Harmony and I are ready for the next step," Melody explained with a playful smirk. Over the past year, Sally had become more than just an assistant. She was now a close friend and one of my two bridesmaids for the upcoming wedding. The other bridesmaid was Kim, of course. Sally gave us a knowing look. "With the way you two walk, I don't think it'll take Terry long to notice," she said with a mischievous grin. "Practice makes perfect," I responded with a wink. "Hey, you stay out of this," Melody chimed in, lightly nudging me with her shoulder. "Sally and I have a lot to talk about. Not with you." I kept quiet, but I could feel Melody press a little closer to me as she and Sally continued their conversation. Later that night, we called Harmony, William and Martha to fill them in on our recent conversation with Mackenzie. After that, we contacted Kim to share the news. They were all stunned, but agreed that we should focus on the wedding and wait to see if Mackenzie's threat would amount to anything. It wasn't long before Kim received the official papers. Mackenzie was suing me for the $142,000 in the university account, the same amount from my divorce with Carol. And if that wasn't enough, she was demanding an additional $250,000 for emotional distress and financial hardship. The court date had been set for the Monday after our wedding. We had to change our honeymoon plans. William, ever the problem solver, arranged for us to take a special flight on Sunday afternoon to Sydney. After my court appearance on Monday morning, we would catch our international flight to Honolulu later that day. The Delez family had generously offered us a 10-day all-expenses-paid honeymoon, which we were both incredibly grateful for. I felt certain that the court case with Mackenzie would be resolved quickly, and that I could finally focus on my future with my two beautiful brides. Still, there were some concerns about the fact that we were getting married in a church, but the ceremony went off without a hitch. Pastor Dan received help from several church members and Martha to decorate, creating a warm and inviting atmosphere. William proudly walked both his daughters down the aisle, both of them in matching dresses with long trains, trailing behind them, symbolizing their shared hope for a future together. Most of the Delez Inc. staff attended, along with my parents, who had flown up for the weekend. Paul, my best man, Kim, and Candace, who was now enjoying herself, were all there to celebrate with us. When Pastor Dan said, "You may kiss your brides," I had the honor of kissing both Harmony and Melody, while the guests erupted into applause. Afterward, we signed the official wedding papers, with Pastor Dan, Melody, and Paul as witnesses. Then we all signed the final pages of a legal agreement that officially recognized Melody as my partner in a civil relationship. Although we wouldn't be married in the traditional sense, we had agreed to share many of the things that married couples do. Kim had even printed the signature page on the same type of paper as the official wedding registry. The celebration continued at the reception, where about 100 guests were in attendance. I danced with both of my brides while William and my dad took turns dancing with whichever one of us wasn't currently in their arms. I also shared dances with Martha and my mother, who, despite her ongoing battle with cancer, was holding on to hope. We were all buoyed by the news of a new treatment involving a bone marrow transplant and a new chemotherapy drug, though it would still be a few years before it would be available. For now, we clung to that hope. Most of the guests stayed until we left around 1 a.m. After a long day, Melody and I shared a quiet moment in our hotel room before falling into a peaceful sleep. The next morning, feeling refreshed, we shared another intimate momentone that brought us even closer than before. After checking out, we headed home to Friendly Smiles for a light lunch with William, Martha, Mum, Dad, Kim and Paul. From there, we made our way to the private airstrip for our flight to Mayland. Mum, Dad, Kim, Paul and Candace would be traveling with us. I hadn't thought much about the court hearing or Mackenzie's lawsuit, but as we took off, I opened the folder that Kim had handed me. The hearing would be private, given that Mackenzie was above the age of consent, but still considered a minor in legal terms. The case would be heard in family court, and only close family members could attend. That meant it would just be Kim, my lawyer, and I in the courtroom. Mackenzie was suing me for the original amount of $142,000, plus an additional $250,000 for emotional distress and financial hardship. As we prepared for what lay ahead, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get more complicated. I focused all my attention on the front of the courtroom, desperately trying to mask my emotions. Kim, sensing my unease, gently placed her hand on my arm, offering a quiet assurance. "You'll be fine," she whispered. "Once this is over, you can finally go on your honeymoon with your wives." That thought brought a smile to my face, however faint. Just then the judge entered, and I felt my smile widen a little more. The same judge who had finalized our divorce was back. I could see the discontent in the eyes of the Morrisons and Carol, but for some reason, this felt like a moment I could handle. Kim squeezed my hand, a small but comforting gesture, and we both stood to show respect. The judge's voice rang out. "This court is now in session." We all settled into our seats. He flipped through some documents, taking his time, before shifting his gaze toward Mackenzie, then me. His eyes held a trace of familiarity. "I believe we've met before, Mr. Other, Mrs. Morrison," the judge said, as if recalling an old memory. "A few years ago, if I'm not mistaken?" "Yes, Your Honor," I replied, my voice steady. Carol merely nodded, her expression unreadable. The judge then turned to Mackenzie. "And you are Miss Mackenzie Morrison, daughter of Mr. Terry Other and adopted daughter of, I believe it's Mr. Stephen Morrison?" He paused briefly, his eyes narrowing in slight confusion. I couldn't help but suppress a smile at the mix-up, though Mackenzie's lawyer encouraged her to answer quickly. "Yes, Your Honor," Mackenzie said, her voice wavering slightly. The judge continued, reading from his notes. "We're here today because you are suing your biological father for university expenses, emotional distress, and financial claims, correct?" With a nod from Mackenzie's lawyer, she confirmed, "Yes, Your Honor." The judge took a moment, his eyes scanning the papers further before looking up again. "Your adopted father, Mr. Morrison, has recently tried to harm your biological father." The judge continued, "Reports indicate that Mr. Other faced severe medical complications twice and spent significant time in the hospital." Mackenzie's face froze in shock. She turned to glance at me, as though trying to process the information. It was clear that neither the Morrisons nor her mother had shared this detail with her. I kept my gaze fixed on the judge, unwilling to meet Mackenzie's eyes. The judge pressed on. "As a result, your adopted father has lost his medical license and is awaiting trial. He is only here today due to special permission granted for you as a minor in this case against your biological father." His eyes moved back to Mackenzie, now filled with curiosity. "Miss Morrison, can you explain why you are suing your biological father?" Mackenzie, still fixated on me, seemed to have missed the judge's question. She didn't even notice the lawyer gently nudging her arm, guiding her back to the matter at hand. "I take it from the way you've been looking at Mr. Other," the judge said, his tone softening, "that you were unaware your adopted father tried to harm your biological father, or that Mr. Other almost lost his life." Mackenzie blinked, clearly unsettled. "Number I didn't know, Your Honor," she muttered, uncertainty clouding her expression. The judge, unmoved, continued. "Let's change direction. Can you tell me, based on what you know, how your biological father, Mr. Terry Other, has caused you any emotional distress?" Mackenzie hesitated, glancing from her mother to her adopted father and then back to me. I could feel the tension in the room as both of them scowled in my direction. I stayed silent, maintaining a steady focus on the judge. Her lawyer spoke up, attempting to guide the case. "Your Honor, Miss Morrison's claim of emotional pain stems from Mr. Other's refusal to leave her adopted father alone. Mr. Other has approached Mr. Morrison on multiple occasions, each time causing distress within the family." The judge seemed amused by the lawyer's remarks but listened intently. "I see. Mr. Forsyth, is it?" "Yes, Your Honor," the lawyer replied. "And how long have you been practicing law?" "2 years, Your Honor," Forsyth responded, his voice a little more hesitant now. 2 years, the judge repeated, his gaze narrowing. "How many cases have you handled that involve family members suing one another based on weak or unverified claims?" "This would be my first case, Your Honor," Forsyth admitted, his voice growing smaller. The judge gave a slight smile, the corners of his mouth twitching. "It certainly sounds like your first case, Mr. Forsyth." The judge then turned his attention back to Mackenzie. "Miss Morrison, let me bring you up to speed. I have no evidence indicating that Mr. Other has been cruel or unfair to you. In fact, the police reports and video evidence I've reviewed suggest otherwise." Mackenzie's face paled as the judge fixed his gaze on her. "Miss Morrison, do you often call your biological father, the man who raised you for most of your life, an expletive?" Mackenzie's lawyer immediately objected. "Your Honor, Miss Morrison should not have to answer a question that rude." The judge, however, overruled the objection. "I have proof here from recent text messages and video evidence in this case, showing that Mr. Morrison tried to harm Mr. Other. I ask again, Miss Morrison, do you call your biological father an expletive?" Mackenzie flushed, her face turning red as she tried to answer, though her voice was shaky. I'm embarrassed to say, yes, Your Honor. But I didn't know Stephen tried to hurt him. If I had known." The judge raised a hand, cutting her off. "I wasn't asking for an explanation, Miss Morrison. I was just asking a simple question." He paused, his gaze unyielding. "Now, another question. Did your biological father ever hurt you before you and your mother left him? Did he ever show a lack of care or love?" Mackenzie turned toward me, her eyes searching mine, but I kept my gaze fixed forward, afraid to meet her eyes. "No, Your Honor," she finally answered, her voice small. "He was always kind." The judge nodded. "Thank you, Miss Morrison. One final question. After you and your mother left your biological father for your adopted father, did Mr. Other ever mistreat you?" Mackenzie's eyes flicked nervously between me, Carol, and the man we were discussing. He gave the slightest nod, as though signaling her. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Yes, Your Honor, many times." The judge leaned back in his chair, clearly weighing the gravity of her words. I felt a surge of anger rising in me, but Kim's grip on my hand tightened, a silent warning. I held my tongue, understanding the delicate balance of the situation. "Can you explain what you mean by mistreatment, Miss Morrison?" the judge asked, his tone sharp. "Even a minor can face consequences for lying in court." Mackenzie glanced at the man again, who nodded once more, before she turned to face me. It was the first time since the judge had entered that her eyes met mine directly. There was fear in her gaze, a kind of lost confusion. I wanted to reach out, to help, but I felt utterly powerless. Kim spoke up then, her voice firm and unwavering. "Objection, Your Honor. I believe Miss Morrison has been influenced in her responses." The judge paused, considering her words, and then nodded in agreement. "Sustained, Counselor. I agree. I believe." Miss Morrison had clearly been affected by the constant pressure of her counselor's influence, and I couldn't help but agree with the sentiments being expressed. "Security," the judge's voice cut through the tension in the room. "Please escort Mr. Morrison out of this room for the remainder of the hearing." Mr. Morrison's face twisted with outrage. "You can't do this," he bellowed, his fists clenched in frustration. "That man has to pay for ruining my life. I'm not telling my daughter what to say, I'm just making sure she understands how to speak the truth." A hushed silence filled the courtroom. The judge raised an eyebrow, his tone sharp. "Mr. Morrison, if you believe I haven't noticed the gestures you made toward Miss Morrison when you thought no one was watching, you're sorely mistaken. I am dangerously close to holding you in contempt of court." "Mr. Morrison," the judge continued, his voice unwavering, "you are now in contempt of court. You will remain in the holding area until we determine whether you have violated the terms of your parole. Security, remove him." As the guards moved to take him away, the room held its breath. Mr. Morrison continued to shout curses, swearing revenge, his voice trailing off as he was escorted out. It seemed that the dreams of Carol had truly haunted him, casting a shadow over everything. The judge quickly regained control of the room. Miss Morrison, he addressed her firmly, I will ask you once again, has Mr. Other ever treated you badly or mistreated you in any way? His gaze was direct, urging her to answer honestly. Please, look at me as you respond. Feel free to explain further if needed. Mackenzie hesitated, her body stiffening slightly, her eyes darting to me. Carol gave me a quick glance as well, the tension palpable. It felt as if the entire room was holding its collective breath. Mackenzie hesitated, her body stiffening slightly, her eyes darting to me. Carol gave me a quick glance as well, the tension palpable. It felt as if the entire room was holding its collective breath. Finally, Mackenzie spoke, her voice fragile and trembling. No, sir, she said, her words barely above a whisper. He never treated me badly. I know he was hurt and angry when we left him, and I know we caused him pain, but he always tried to teach me, even when he was disappointed in me. He's never been cruel to me. She paused, her voice breaking as she continued. My father, Stephen, he's been upset with my real dad since we moved in with him. Mum and Stephen always tell me how much better off I am now, how much better things are, and how my real dad would have hurt me if I'd stayed in contact with him after the divorce. Tears began to spill from her eyes, and Kim, seated beside me, gently squeezed my hand. Though I tried to keep my emotions in check, a small part of me stirred. It was hard not to feel something, even after everything, yet her words stung deeper than I expected. It hurt more than I was willing to admit. Mackenzie's voice cracked again as she continued. When Stephen and Dad fought in the hospital, and Dad hit Stephen, I was told that Dad lied and made Stephen lose his job. And I've heard so many times that all our money problems were his fault. She paused, her gaze flicking toward me as the judge urged her to focus. I didn't know, Mackenzie sobbed, her hands trembling. I didn't know that Stephen tried to hurt him. I'm so sorry, Dad. I didn't know. Her apology, though sincere, caused a small flicker of warmth inside me, a fleeting moment of tenderness. But it was nothing more than a flicker. I couldn't let myself feel too much. Not now, not after everything. I turned my gaze away, keeping my emotions tightly bound. Miss Morrison, the judge's voice broke through the moment. Please focus on me now. Mackenzie looked up, her eyes red from crying, and nodded. The judge turned to her with a calm nod. Thank you for your honest response. It's the first time we've heard the truth from you today. Then, he addressed Mr. Other's attorney. Now, I invite Mr. Other or his attorney to respond to the claim of mental cruelty. Kim stood, her posture poised as always. We appreciate Miss Morrison's honesty, Your Honor, she began, but we have no additional information to offer, and we continue to deny the claim of mental cruelty. The judge nodded, acknowledging her statement. Noted. Thank you, Counselor. We can now dismiss this claim, correct? Both sides agreed, and the judge continued. Now, let's turn our attention to the issue of financial hardship. I'm having difficulty understanding this part, Miss Morrison. He turned to the papers in front of him, his gaze thoughtful. In your parents' divorce agreement, the funds designated for your university education were kept with Mr. Other because you chose to let Miss Morrison adopt you. This was because your biological father was the only one who contributed to that account. Since you and your mother decided to sever ties with him and obtain a restraining order, it seemed those funds were no longer yours. The judge held up a copy of the letter Carol had written to Mackenzie's biological father, which made Carol flush with embarrassment. In this letter, it clearly states that the reason you chose to cut ties was because your biological father could not provide a better life for you as a plumber. Now, since you removed yourself from his care, I fail to see how you can blame your financial difficulties on him. Would you care to explain? Mr. Forrester, the attorney for the Morrisons, spoke up, his voice steady yet strained. Your Honor, the Morrisons believe their financial troubles stem directly from their dealings with Mr. Other after the divorce. The judge raised a brow, studying him. I see where you're coming from, but your reasoning seems flawed. Please explain why you think Mr. Other is responsible for the Morrisons' financial woes. Mr. Forrester leaned forward, his voice firm. If Mr. Other had never continued to engage with Mr. Morrison, he wouldn't have been put on probation. Mr. Morrison wouldn't have threatened him, and the confrontation wouldn't have led to Mr. Morrison losing his job. Now they are solely relying on Mr. Morrison's trust fund to survive. The judge leaned back in his chair, watching the attorney closely. He scribbled something on his pad, a bemused expression on his face. Mr. Forrester, the judge said with a slight chuckle, I don't think you quite understand how unreasonable that sounds. From the evidence before me, it appears that it was the Morrisons who caused these problems, not Mr. Other. Mr. Other was a victim in these situations, injured twice, and he was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Mr. Forsey shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Your Honor, we still argue that if Mr. Other hadn't been involved, Mr. Morrison wouldn't have done what he did, and the Morrisons wouldn't be facing their current financial situation. Therefore, Mr. Other should bear some responsibility. The judge's smile grew wider. He turned to Kim and me. Do you have any response? Kim stood, confident and calm as always. Your Honor, while we acknowledge the interactions between my client and the Morrisons, at no point does my client accept responsibility for the financial difficulties they now face. Kim took a deep breath. We live in a free society, where we have the right to choose who we engage with. In every incident between my client and the Morrisons, they approached him first. He never initiated contact. In each case, except for the one at the hospital where my client was unknowingly drugged, my client made every effort to distance himself from these situations. My client was the one mistreated, and he has no obligation to bear the financial burden that is the result of the Morrisons' choices. She paused for a moment, then added, had the Morrisons simply chosen not to engage with my client and walked away, they wouldn't be facing these financial problems today. They wouldn't be here. Their situation is the consequence of their actions. The judge regarded Kim thoughtfully, clearly impressed by the argument she had just presented, one that seemed to resonate with the situation at hand. I glanced at Mackenzie, who appeared distant, her face flushed with tears. She hadn't caught much of the conversation. She was still overwhelmed with emotion, sitting in her chair, looking lost. Carol, meanwhile, shifted uncomfortably, torn between her loyalties, her gaze flickering between Mackenzie and me. It was clear that words failed her. Considering the circumstances, the judge began, I have decided that the funds will remain with Mr. Other. I raised my hand, signaling for a moment to speak. Yes, Mr. Other, the judge replied, his voice even, though a bit weary. I exhaled deeply, as others had done before me. Speaking was never easy in a setting like this, but it was necessary. Your Honor, I began, trying to steady my nerves. I want to be completely transparent here. I don't harbor any feelings for my ex-wife anymore. She made her choices when she left me for someone else, and I can't find it in myself to forgive her. And as for my daughter, the way she has treated me in the past few years has wounded me in ways I can't quite describe. The love I once had for her has withered. The judge nodded sympathetically. I understand, Mr. Other. This is a story I encounter more often than I'd like in my line of work. What exactly are you trying to express? I want to do one last thing for my daughter, I said, feeling the weight of the words even as they left my lips. Mackenzie, hearing me, lifted her head slightly, a glimmer of hope flickering in her tear-filled eyes. I've rebuilt my life over the past couple of years, I continued, my voice steadying as I spoke of my journey. It hasn't been easy. There have been struggles, mostly from the women in this room and the man you removed earlier. But through it all, I found love again. In fact, I married just last weekend, and we plan to leave for our honeymoon right after this hearing. I paused, allowing the room to absorb my words, then added, I know that I may not want to have any further contact with my ex-wife or my daughter, but I'm ready to move forward with my new family. It's time to build something new, something happy. The judge raised an eyebrow, and I felt a mixture of nerves and determination. I reached for Kim, and she handed me a document. Her eyes silently asked if I was certain about what I was about to do. I nodded, though the decision was bittersweet. This document, I said, holding it up for everyone to see, is from my lawyer. It stipulates that I will place $142,000 funds that I had intended for Mackenzie's college education into a special trust. This money will be reserved solely for her living and educational expenses while she's in university. She can start next year if she qualifies. Carol's eyes widened in disbelief, but Mackenzie's face remained hidden in her hands, still crying. If Mackenzie doesn't pursue higher education, I continued, the trust will remain intact until she turns 30, at which point she can withdraw up to $5,000 per month. There's one more condition. Neither Carol nor Mackenzie may contact me again. A heavy silence hung in the air, and I could almost hear the collective breath being held in the room. I've been asking for peace for years, I said, my voice softening. Every time my ex-wife reaches out, it's always about money. Since the divorce, I've left the account untouched, but I've had enough. This is my final gesture to Mackenzie. Under these terms, I can't continue to be drained emotionally by this situation. I paused for a moment, struggling to hold back the tears that threatened to betray me. I can't bear the thought of confronting the girl I once raised, the caring young woman she used to be, the one who now insults me with every word. Still, I want to help her, even if it's just this last time. I want to keep Stephen Morrison, the man who tore my family apart, away from that money. If I can do that, I think I can finally find peace. I looked around, seeing the tears in Carol's eyes as well as the judge's attentive expression. Mackenzie was still crying, and I could feel the weight of the years of regret, love, and pain swirling around me. I spoke again, my voice cracking slightly. I need to move forward. My life with my new family is waiting for me, and I can't be bound by the past any longer. But if this is the price to pay for peace for my new life, and for Mackenzie to have her future, I'm willing to offer it. When I finished speaking, I turned to Kim, accepting a tissue to wipe my eyes. The judge cleared his throat and turned to Kim. "Do you have anything further to add?" he asked, his tone neutral. Kim nodded and stood. "Yes, Your Honor. We've agreed to give Miss Mackenzie Morrison 30 days from today to accept this offer. If she declines, the agreement will be void, and the money will remain with Mr. Other." The judge nodded solemnly. "In cases of emotional harm, I rule in favor of Mr. Terry Other, with no financial obligations owed by either party. Both sides will cover their own legal fees. The financial offer made to Miss Mackenzie Morrison is outside the jurisdiction of this court." I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of finality wash over me. Before dismissing the court, the judge turned his attention to Carol. "Mrs. Morrison, I don't often address individuals in the audience, but I believe I must say this to you. Your actions in these proceedings have not painted you in a positive light. Many of the issues at hand stem directly from your choices. While you may believe you're in a difficult financial position, I don't think that's entirely accurate." Carol swallowed hard, visibly shaken. "I cannot tell you how to live your life, Mrs. Morrison," the judge continued, "but I urge you to think carefully about your future and your daughters as well. It may be best for you to step away from Mr. Other and let him move on. He has found happiness. You too need to find peace." Carol nodded, seemingly at a loss for words. The judge concluded, "That will be all. This court is adjourned." As the proceedings ended, Kim took the agreement to Mackenzie's lawyer, and we left the courtroom. Outside, we found Paul and the girls, who were anxiously awaiting news. Despite the somber mood lingering in me, Kim shared most of the details, including the emotional words I had spoken at the end. The girls wrapped me in warm, supportive hugs, their soft whispers of encouragement easing some of the heaviness I felt. We spent the next hour talking and decompressing. At one point, Kim noticed Carol and Mackenzie leaving the courthouse. They were alone, walking slowly, their expressions weary, the weight of it all evident on their faces. I understood how they felt more than they knew. My heart ached for them in a way I didn't expect. But I had done what I could, and now my new life awaited. The journey ahead with my family would be different from the one I had imagined years ago, but it was mine to shape. During those blissful 10 days, I had the chance to truly connect with my wives in a way I hadn't before. We were completely at ease with each other, reveling in the simplicity of each moment. Most of the time, we wore hardly anything at all, basking in the freedom and warmth of the days. And when we did dress, they looked absolutely stunning in their swimsuits, effortlessly drawing the admiration of everyone around. I couldn't help but feel a swell of pride as I strolled alongside them, two beautiful women, one on each arm, each with their own grace and charm. It was a picture-perfect time, and the world seemed to fade away as we enjoyed the moments we shared. After our trip, I found myself almost completely detached from my past life. Mackenzie had signed the necessary agreements, so Kim handled the rest, transferring the funds into the trust as planned. She asked if I wanted to know what Mackenzie would choose as her course of study at the university, but I declined. I had a sense that chapter of my life was finished. 2 months later, however, we learned that both my wives were pregnant, something I hadn't anticipated. They had stopped their birth control a month before our wedding, but hadn't mentioned it to me. Soon enough, both started feeling sick in the mornings, and after a few doctor visits, the truth came to light. I was going to be a father again twice over. The news sent ripples of joy through both our families. My parents, William and Martha, were thrilled. Work colleagues congratulated me, teasing me with a mix of envy and admiration. But the real surprise came when we went for the 12-week scan. Both of my wives were carrying twins. I was stunned, unsure of how we'd manage 4 babies all at once, but as I lay there next to my wives that night, holding them close, I knew we'd face the challenge together, no matter what. Kim and Paul were equally shocked. Kim couldn't help but tease me about my luck, 2 wives, both pregnant with twins. She and Paul were also expecting again, which meant Candice, their first child, would soon have both siblings and cousins to share her world with. So now, we were preparing for 5 new arrivals. However, amid this joy, there was also a cloud of worry. My mother's health was deteriorating. Her battle with cancer was becoming more difficult, and we were all deeply concerned. Harmony, always the voice of reason, consulted with multiple doctors. Before my mother became too ill to travel, we managed to arrange consultations with 3 cancer specialists zone in Brisbane, 2 in Sydney. After reviewing her condition, they recommended palliative care, focusing on making her comfortable for as long as possible. At that point, we decided to bring my parents closer to us for both their support and the impending arrivals of the babies. By the time my wives were 6 months pregnant, we had settled my parents into a small house about 15 minutes away. Dad found part-time work with a local builder, and Mom, though weakened by her illness, was never without company, either family or hired caregivers. Kim and Paul also moved nearby, into a house just a short distance from my parents' place. Kim, a few weeks ahead in her pregnancy, was often irritable and exhausted, and much of the heavy lifting fell on Paul and me during the move. Kim, in her usual way, was particular about everything being just so, scolding us for the slightest disorganization as she prepared for the arrival of her second child. Meanwhile, Candice, their young daughter, found the whole thing amusing, often repeating full sentences and delighting in the chaos of her mum, asking Dad to move the same box multiple times. The air conditioning in our home was always set to an Arctic chill, something all 3 of the pregnant women seemed to love. It reminded me of a scene from Father of the Bride Part 2, where Steve Martin is constantly changing clothes to adjust to the temperature changes as he moves between the house and outdoors. Our house, much like that, became a refuge from the heat, and we made sure it stayed cool throughout the day. As the time drew near, the nights became more difficult. While the pregnancy progressed, it became increasingly hard for my wives to snuggle with me. It wasn't that they didn't want to, but their growing bellies made it uncomfortable. Instead, each night, I held them as best I could, our hands clasped together as we drifted into sleep, eagerly awaiting the arrival of our children. When the moment finally came, it was swift. Both of my wives went into labor just 2 hours apart. Due to the risks associated with carrying twins, we decided it was safest for Melody to undergo a C-section. The 2 operating rooms were prepared side by side, and I moved between them, my nerves on edge. The first baby to arrive was my son, Adam. With a full head of brown hair and a loud, healthy cry, he was the picture of vitality. Shortly after, my sweet daughter Grace was born. She was quiet, her head bald, but her bright green eyes were striking. Then came our third daughter, Beth, who shared her mother's strength and voice, and lastly, my second son, whom we had planned to name Colin. However, when I looked at his face, so similar to my father's, I knew we had to name him after my father instead. 3 days later, Kim went into labor and gave birth to Holly, Candice's younger sister. In the span of just a few days, our family had expanded in a way I could never have imagined. With 4 babies, our house was full, and chaos reigned. At times, I almost regretted my earlier declaration about how wonderful it would be to raise such a large family, but I couldn't imagine being anywhere else. The first 6 months were an exhausting blur. No one was sleeping, diapers were constantly being changed, bottles were always being prepared, and the babies seemed to need something every minute. Yet, slowly, we found a rhythm. By 6 months, all 4 babies began sleeping through the night, and our lives started to feel a little more manageable. Our closeness, too, was revived stronger than ever. However, the joy we felt at this growing family was tempered by the loss we were about to endure. My mother's health continued to worsen, and she passed away when the children were nearly 2 years old. We had been by her side every step of the way, and in her final days, she showered her grandchildren with as much love as her frail body would allow. I hope the kids will remember her fondly, the way she cherished each of them, even in her last moments. There is a wall of photos down the hallway, filled with pictures of Mom and her 6 grandchildren. Dad was heartbroken but proud of the woman he had shared his life with. In her final days, Mom was at peace, knowing she had made a difference. I will never forget the afternoon she asked us all to gather. We sat together, reminiscing about our childhoods, laughing and joking about the absurdities of raising so many kids at once. Mum, fragile yet still strong, asked for some alone time with each of us. She held both Melody and Harmony close, her words full of love and gratitude. As she spoke to them, her voice quivered with emotion. "You have brought so much joy into Terry's life," she said. "I never thought I'd see him this happy again after all he went through, but you both arrived like a storm and healed his heart in ways I could never express." The love shared in that room was palpable, and my wives were moved to tears when they left. Kim and Paul came in next. When I went in, Mom was already in Kim's arms, both of them crying. I sat beside her, taking her frail hand in mine. It was clear the end was near, but I would carry her love with me forever. "My dears," Mum whispered, her voice faint, "I love you both more than words can say. No parent could ever be prouder than I am of you two. I've watched you grow, and I cherish how, even as adults, you've always kept close, especially during tough times. You've learned to care for one another, to stay strong. But now, I have something I need to ask of you both." "Yes, Mum, anything," I answered, my voice thick with emotion, while Kim held on to Mum as though afraid she might fade from our lives. "I need you to look after your father," she continued, her breath slow and labored. "He's trying to hold it all together, but he needs your help with what's coming. He has many years left, and I don't want him to suffer. Your father is my true love. Even death can't break our bond, and I'll always be with him." The words stung, and tears welled up as I thought back to just a few years earlier, when Mum had asked something similar. The cancer had ravaged her body, but her heart, even in those final moments, was solely focused on Dad. We cried, helpless, holding on to her. "Promise me," she whispered, "you'll care for your father." "We promise, Mum," Kim said through her tears. I nodded in agreement. We sat in silence, surrounded by the warmth of our family, savoring the moments that felt too precious to let go. After a few moments, Mum asked to speak to me alone. Kim wiped her eyes, gently patting my shoulder before stepping out of the room. Mum pulled me closer, resting her weary head against my chest. "My boy, my wonderful Terry," she said softly. "I've had the privilege of watching the man you've become. You've always been slow to anger, and even when life hurt you, even when Carol and Mackenzie let you down, you always tried to do the right thing." I shook my head, unsure. "Not always, Mum." She smiled faintly, her breath struggling to keep pace. "I know, Terry. None of us are perfect. Not even me. You thought I was St. Josephine, didn't you?" I couldn't help but chuckle, but she laughed softly, a sound filled with both weariness and love. "No, not always. Your father and I have never told anyone this, but before you and Kim were born, we went through a rough patch," she revealed, her voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. I froze. This was news to me. I hadn't expected such honesty, but I could tell she needed to share it. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my composure. She continued, her voice a bit more distant as she recalled the past. "After we bought our first house, your dad worked long hours. I was a bank teller, but he wasn't around much, not even on weekends. And, well, when an assistant manager at the bank started paying me attention, I admit, I felt flattered. It was harmless at first, but then I felt my stomach churn with surprise. Had Mom ever considered straying from Dad? She must have read my expression because she smiled softly, almost reassuringly. "No, Terry, I never cheated on your father, but something could have happened if it weren't for an event that changed everything." I waited, unsure whether to speak or simply let her continue. She took a breath and smiled at the memory. "It was at a gathering, a few weeks later. That's when I saw Cindy Phillips. She was trying to get close to your dad, and he wasn't exactly pushing her away. I noticed, of course, and Cindy saw me watching. She smiled, put her hand on your father's shoulder, and acted like she might steal him away. You see, Cindy worked at the bank too, and had seen the attention the assistant manager was giving me. She thought if I could have some fun, then she could do the same with my handsome husband." I was stunned. "What did you do?" "Well, I dropped everything," she replied with a smile. "I told him to take me home and show me he cared. And he did. He did it so well, in fact, that your sister was born 9 months later." A bittersweet laugh escaped her as she thought back. "A couple of years later, you came along too. But if it hadn't been for that moment, Cindy's smile, her hand on your father's shoulder, our lives could have taken a very different path." We paused for a moment, reflecting on how the smallest moments can shift the course of an entire life. "Now, Terry," she said softly, breaking the silence, "I know you may never forgive Carol. Perhaps you shouldn't. But what about Mackenzie? Do you think you could find it in your heart to forgive her?" I swallowed hard, looking at her fragile form. "I don't know, Mum. I haven't thought about it for years. She hurt me deeply, and I'm not sure how I would feel if I ever saw her again." She nodded gently. "Terry, please, I'm not asking you to chase after her or bring her back into your life. There's so much happening right now with your family and Kim, but please, think about it. Could you find it in you to forgive her?" I hesitated. "I'll try, Mum. I can't promise anything, but if I ever see her again, I'll do my best." She smiled, a small, content smile. "That's all I can ask, dear. Just that. Just then, Dad came in. His face was a mix of emotions, a fragile smile on his lips, but tears in his eyes. "It won't be long now," he said softly. "She knows it, and she's asked us all to be with her." The family gathered around her, holding each other as we shared stories and tried to lift her spirits. The kids ran in and out of the room, offering hugs to their grandmother, oblivious to the gravity of the situation but sensing her unwellness. Laughter mixed with tears as we shared those final moments. As we spoke of Kim's pregnancy, something light-hearted, Mom chuckled softly. "It's going to be a boy," she said with a smile. But as we looked at her, we knew. The light had left her eyes, her breath had ceased, but there was a peaceful calm in her expression. She had slipped away quietly, as if the presence that made her mother was no longer needed. Josephine Marie Other, our mother, the woman who had always loved us deeply despite her quiet nature, was gone, but she would never be forgotten. Her appearance had remained relatively unchanged, perhaps even improved, since we last crossed paths. The way she looked at me, however, revealed a certain uncertainty. She had no idea how I would respond to her unexpected arrival. And truth be told, the reunion would not be a joyous one. Our second visitor, Mackenzie, greeted me with a quiet, "Hi, Daddy." As she spoke, my former daughter-in-law, Carol, bent down to pick up the food tray I had dropped. She then turned and placed it on the table. I glanced toward Martha, who immediately recognized them and glared with an intensity that didn't need words. "Martha," I said, trying to steady my emotions, "could you please take the kids and get them something to eat? I think this might take a while." Her expression softened, but there was no hiding the undercurrent of tension. Martha understood me better than anyone else in that room. Over the years, she had stood by me through thick and thin, offering unwavering support, and in moments like this, she knew precisely what I was feeling. Martha was a formidable woman, one of the sharpest minds I had ever known. Cross her or her family, and you'd not only have a problem with Martha, but with her entire circle of friends and the community at large. I could see that Carol and Mackenzie had likely encountered her wrath before, even if I wasn't fully aware of the specifics. With a sigh, Martha shifted her focus. "It's all right, Terry," she said gently. "You take care of what you need to. I'll handle the kids." I nodded and turned back to face my ex-family, my frustration mounting. I could feel the anger bubbling just beneath the surface, but I fought to keep my voice steady. For the sake of the children, I swallowed my words, but I couldn't hold back the bitterness. "You both need to understand that you're not welcome here," I said, my tone firm. I almost shouted the last part, but I managed to keep it controlled. Carol's face darkened with what seemed to be a mixture of disappointment and expectation, as if she had anticipated my reaction. Mackenzie, on the other hand, looked as though she might crumble into tears. Kim stood beside me, her presence a comforting reminder that I wasn't alone in this. Melody and Harmony flanked me on the other side. Melody, ever the empathetic one, took my hand, offering her silent support. Harmony, too, understood. She knew these two women all too well and could sense the heavy weight of my emotions. Carol let out a long, exhausted sigh and briefly scanned the room, her eyes lingering on me once more. There was a time, many years ago, when I could have looked into her eyes and felt love. Now, all I saw was sadness, regret, and a profound sense of pain, and that struck me in a way I wasn't prepared for. "We know, Terry," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion, "but we really need to talk to you." Before I could respond, the clattering of the tray on the floor interrupted the moment. Everyone turned to look, the tension in the air palpable. Carol's voice broke through the silence, her tone weary and worn. "Hi, Terry," she said, her eyes showing signs of fatigue. Over the years, the woman who had once been full of life now seemed smaller, her curves hidden under the weight she had gained. The years had not been kind to her. I, on the other hand, still maintained my health, perhaps even more so than before. As I looked at her, I realized she had never expected a warm welcome, especially not uninvited, not after everything. Mackenzie, standing next to Carol, said, "Hi, Daddy," her voice soft, almost hesitant. I noticed she had her head lowered, her eyes peeking at me from underneath the baseball cap I had given her years ago. She didn't resemble the rebellious young woman I once knew. Instead, she seemed fragile, almost broken, much like her mother. For a long moment, we all just stood there, silence enveloping the room. The only sounds were those of the children at the table, but even they were sensing the change, the disruption in their once peaceful dinner. I bent down to pick up the tray I had dropped and turned back to the table. Looking at Martha, I signaled to her once more. She knew exactly who these two were and regarded them with a stare that could freeze anyone in their tracks. "Martha, could you help the kids?" I asked again, my voice quieter now. She stopped glaring, her features softening as she nodded in understanding. "I'll handle the kids, Terry," she replied, her tone calm but resolute. It was clear she knew how to manage such situations, always putting the needs of the family first. Turning back to Carol and Mackenzie, I had to force myself to remain composed. "Listen," I said, my voice colder now. "I won't say everything I'm thinking right now, but you need to understand you're not welcome here." Carol appeared unfazed, as if this confrontation was something she had long anticipated. Mackenzie, on the other hand, looked as if she were on the verge of tears, her face crumpled with an emotion I couldn't quite place. Kim stood resolute beside me, her presence a quiet strength, while Melody and Harmony remained close, offering their silent solidarity. Carol met my gaze again, her eyes filled with an emotion I hadn't expected. "We need to talk, Terry," she repeated, this time with a hint of desperation in her voice. I hadn't expected them to show up in Bathurst. The legal papers had made it clear Mackenzie wasn't allowed near me if she wanted her trust money for school. Both women had blamed me for the issues in their lives, even though they were the ones who made the decisions that led to those problems. Looking at Carol now, it was impossible to ignore the toll the years had taken on her. Unlike my wives, who seemed to glow with life, Carol had let herself go. Her face was weathered, and her body had become unappealing, more resembling someone who had given up than a woman in her late 40s. Mackenzie, however, seemed to have undergone a transformation, though not for the better. She was thinner now, her skin loose, her movements stiff. She looked fragile, much like her mother. I wasn't sure why they had come here. After all, they had made it clear that they blamed me for everything that went wrong in their lives. But I had a nagging suspicion they were after something. The last few years hadn't been easy. Carol's new husband, Stephen Morrison, whom we all referred to as the jerk, had been sentenced to 30 years for his violent actions. It seemed the universe had its way of balancing things out, but I couldn't help feeling a flicker of pity for him. As I looked around the room at my loved ones, Melody, Harmony, my father, John, I couldn't help but wonder what exactly these two women wanted from me now. The room was filled with a tense stillness as I surveyed everyone gathered around the table, me beautiful wives, Melody and Harmony, my father, John, my sister, Kim, and her husband, Paul, my in-laws, William and Martha, and Carol and Mackenzie from my past. They were all waiting, their eyes fixed on me, anticipating what would come next. As I turned my gaze back to Carol and Mackenzie, old, raw emotions resurfaced within me. Anger bubbled up at their betrayal, their decision to leave me for another man, all because I wasn't good enough in their eyes. Every conversation we had felt like a disappointment, each word laced with accusations and insults. They often behaved as if they had a right to my money, a notion that seemed completely unfair to me. I wanted to tell them to leave, to kick them out for being so needy and broken, but there was something in me that restrained those feelings. Despite the rising tide of my emotions, this was still my home. I took a deep breath, counted to 10, and focused on what to do next as they continued to stare at me. Finally, I sighed, breaking the silence. "Come on, let's go sit outside and get this over with." I turned to Martha and Paul. "Could you watch the kids and make sure they're fed while we talk outside?" "Sure, Terry," Paul replied, settling down next to his daughter Candice and my son Adam. Between us, we had 7 children, 2 sets of twins. One set was with Harmony and the other with Melody. To make things even more interesting, Melody and Harmony were identical twins. We knew it was rare for twins to have 2 sets of twins from the same father, and medical journals had written about us in recent years. Though we'd spoken with them, we decided against going public or granting interviews. I loved my wives and kids too much to expose them to the madness that could come with fame. As we stepped outside, the cool evening air greeted us. The garden lights flickered softly, and the fresh scent of freshly cut grass filled the atmosphere, making everything feel peaceful and serene. We all gathered around the large family table on the deck, and I took my usual seat, Melody to my right and Harmony to my left. Carol and Mackenzie sat across from me, and Kim took a spot at one end of the table. A few moments later, my dad and William came out, carrying glasses of water for everyone. They made sure Melody and I had drinks, offering wine to Harmony before returning inside to tend to the kids. They knew we needed some privacy. Harmony poured drinks for everyone, ensuring no one went without before she settled back down, waiting for what would come next. After a brief silence, Carol spoke up. "Terry, your place is lovely. I didn't expect." She faltered, realizing that her words were slipping back into old patterns of criticism. Melody didn't miss a beat, her eyes narrowing as she spoke for me. Thank you. It's a wonderful place, and it's been in the family for years. Now that Terry is our husband, he's part of that family too. Carol and Mackenzie exchanged glances, shocked. Our husband? Carol asked, confused. I couldn't help but chuckle. Carol, I'd like you to meet my wife, Mrs. Melody. I gestured toward her, and she smiled proudly. Congrats, Carol mumbled, though it was clear she was struggling to understand. Before I could say anything else, I added, and I'd also like you to meet my other wife, Mrs. Harmony. I smiled as I gestured toward her. Yes, you heard that right. I'm married to both of these wonderful women. Carol sat back, stunned, while Mackenzie stared at us in disbelief. Melody, Harmony, and I exchanged smiles as Kim chuckled softly from across the table. Carol, still struggling to process, glanced at Kim for clarification. Kim nodded in understanding. Oh yes, Carol. After you left him, my little brother saved both of these amazing women when they were in danger. They fell in love with him, and he married them both. Your ex-husband is very much in love with them, and now they have twins with each of these beautiful women. Kim laughed as she added, I have to say, the situation is a bit more complicated than you thought. Mackenzie, still in shock, finally found her voice. So, you're close with both of them? She asked, trying to understand. Yes, Harmony replied with a light laugh. Your former father is very close to both of us. From the very first night he showed us his love and care without hesitation. He's our rock, and he gives everything he has without expecting anything in return. Mackenzie looked down, clearly uncomfortable. I can't believe you and your mum would ever leave such a caring man. Melody immediately chimed in, eager to agree. He's such a good dad, Mackenzie. He really cares for those kids as if they were his everything. Harmony and I couldn't have asked for a better man to show our kids how to treat others in this crazy world. He lives for them. Harmony added, We just don't understand why you let him go. Carol's voice was sharp, interrupting her. Because you see him now. She gestured toward the house and the manicured garden. He has money and a good name. When we were his family, he was just a plumber. Harmony shot back, her voice cold and cutting. You really don't get it, do you, Carol? Carol looked taken aback, her face pale. We would cherish Terry no matter what he had. When we first met him, all he had was what was in his truck. For us, money doesn't matter. He treats us like royalty because he loves us, and we've given him our hearts. We would leave all of this behind, she waved her hand dismissively, if it meant we could keep him. Carol's face turned crimson, and Mackenzie looked away, embarrassed. Kim laughed from her seat. I leaned forward, adding, You had a man who would give you everything, and he did. Don't pretend you don't know that he can please you too. Melody smiled as Harmony joined in, their affection toward me evident. Carol's face was now as red as a tomato, and Mackenzie shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Kim, always the voice of reason, finally spoke up. Okay, everyone, I know we could talk about my brother's talents all night, but let's focus back on Carol and Mackenzie. Everyone turned to face the two women across from me, who were now visibly embarrassed. There's a reason you're here tonight, Kim continued. But first, can you tell us how you found us? This address is private. How did you get past the gate? Mackenzie hesitated, then spoke slowly. Mum and I drove to Bathurst last week. We watched your office to see when you came and went. When we saw Dad's truck, we followed it back here tonight. We got here just before PA did, so we came in right after him before the gate shut. Kim nodded thoughtfully. A bit strange, but it brought you here. But still, why are you here? I knew the answer was coming, and I wasn't sure how much I wanted to hear it. The conversation lingered in the air as Mackenzie remained silent, her eyes red with unshed tears. Finally I spoke, my voice colder than I intended. Your trust agreement, Mackenzie, clearly states that you can't contact Terry. He doesn't want to see either of you anymore. I could feel the weight of my words, but it was nothing compared to the burden my brother had carried over the past year. My brother's been working hard to move on without you two. It's been almost a year since he's given either of you a thought, I added, though the words stung even as I said them. About 8 months, actually, Kim corrected, her voice wavering slightly. You know I take that day off every year, right? On Mackenzie's birthday, I come out here and sit on this deck to remember what was lost. Her words were soft, but laden with the weight of years of sorrow. I couldn't look at Mackenzie. The mere thought of her brought a tear to my eye. It always did. Melody, her voice a gentle breeze in a room full of tension, explained, We let him have his quiet time out here to think. He sits with his drink, staring off into space, but once the sun sets, he comes back in and takes care of us, like he does every other day. She glanced briefly at Carol and Mackenzie, And though her look wasn't filled with animosity, it certainly wasn't welcoming. I dared to meet Mackenzie's eyes then. She was staring at me, her eyes brimming with tears that echoed my own silent grief. All these years, and despite everything, a flicker of the love I once felt for her stirred deep within me, but I quickly turned my gaze away. I wouldn't let myself feel for her again. I had worked too hard to build a life with my girls, my wives, to let her or Carol tear it down. The grip on my hands tightened, as if they could somehow anchor me against this emotional tide. "So what brings you here today, Carol? Mackenzie?" Kim's voice broke through the moment, her tone sharp but calm, sensing the tension hanging heavy between us. The two women exchanged a look before Carol answered, her voice softer than I expected. "We didn't have many options," she said, her eyes briefly meeting the ground as though ashamed of what she had to say next. "Things have been tough these last few years. No, not just tough, really bad." She paused, casting a glance around, looking for any sign of sympathy from us. But we remained silent, waiting for her to continue. Finally, she took a deep breath, as though preparing herself for the confession. "After Stephen's sentencing, I knew we'd never be together again. He's going to be in prison for a long time. So I divorced him." I could feel the air thicken around us, heavy with the unspoken history between us all. "It took a few months," Carol went on, "but his lawyers forced us out of the house. It was his before we married. We got a little money, but not much. Since then, Mackenzie and I have been living in a small two-bedroom apartment on the edge of Matland." Kim's voice was laced with skepticism. "Are you looking for pity?" "No," Carol answered quickly, almost defensively. "I'm not, but after Mackenzie learned about what Stephen had done to Terry, she broke down. I knew right then that we'd ruined any chance of fixing things with Terry. We couldn't make it right." Her words hung in the air like an unheeded warning. "I heard he remarried, but I never expected that he married both of you. I couldn't compete with either of you, let alone both of you," Carol admitted, a bitter smile tugging at her lips. "Honestly, my best days are behind me." She sighed deeply, the sound of regret woven through her voice. "After all of that, I realized I not only ruined my chance with a man who gave me everything, but I also hurt Terry's relationship with Mackenzie." She trailed off, her gaze distant, lost in the quiet of her own self-loathing. "I could say I was pushed by Stephen, that he was the one stirring the trouble, but deep down I know that's not true. I could have divorced Terry, married Stephen, and still helped Mackenzie stay close to her dad. But I chose to destroy Terry, because if I didn't, I could never be with Stephen. And I wanted to be with him. I couldn't hold my voice back any longer." "Why?" I asked, my voice shaking, more out of curiosity than anything else. It was the first time since all this began that I found myself truly wondering, despite the anger still simmering inside me. Carol looked at me then, not just looking to see what she could gain from my reaction, but almost as if she cared about what I might think. "Because I still love you, Terry," she confessed, her voice softer now, almost fragile. "I knew that if I didn't hurt you, I might want you back someday. Stephen was exciting, but he only cared about himself. He wasn't capable of loving anyone, and besides, he wasn't much to look at." Her smile returned, weak and resigned. I could feel my wives holding my hands tighter, their presence a steady reminder of what I had now. They wanted to shout, to scream at her, but they held back, sensing the importance of what was unfolding. Carol continued, "You were right that day in front of the courthouse, Terry, when you said I dreamed of you. I did dream of you taking me back, of us being together like we were when we were younger." She glanced quickly at Mackenzie, a look of apology passing between them. "I'm sorry, Mackenzie, but it's true. In my dreams, I didn't care about your father's job, about any of the things that had changed. I just wanted to be loved again. But then I woke up, and the awful person I had become woke up too." Her gaze grew distant as she continued. "And suddenly, I was Mrs. Stephen Morrison, and I had to destroy Terry again. Stephen fed into that need, and I didn't realize how much I was pushing him, how much my actions drove him to snap. I had little sympathy for what I had done, but I knew we'd never fix things." Her voice trailed off, but there was something that had changed in her. I didn't know what to say, but I needed answers. "So you're divorced, living in a small apartment, but what are you really here for?" I asked, the frustration still burning in my chest. Carol seemed to hesitate before answering. "I know we messed up our chances," she began slowly, "but after the divorce, I had to stop Mackenzie a few times from reaching out to you. She would have lost her trust fund, and that money has helped us stay afloat in our little apartment. I've been working at a local real estate office, anything glamorous, but it was enough. Things weren't great, but we were doing better, together, as mother and daughter. We thought we might never speak to you again." She paused, then looked at me with a sadness I hadn't seen before. But about 6 months ago, Mackenzie started feeling really tired. She'd come home and collapse, exhausted. After some doctor visits, we found out she has a rare form of bone cancer. I clenched my jaw, my heart sinking at the mention of cancer. Is it the same as what my mum had? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Carol nodded, her eyes filled with the same helplessness I had once seen in my own mother's. Yes, Terry, it is. We didn't know at first, but it is. We went to the same specialist your mother saw, and about 3 months ago, he discovered that you're Mackenzie's biological father. Mackenzie looked at me, her eyes full of uncertainty, but there was something else there too, Hope. I could feel it, like a thread pulling at my heart. So what do you need? I asked, my voice strained. Is this about money again? Harmony placed a hand on my arm before I could say more, her touch grounding me. No, honey, she said, her voice calm. I don't think they want money this time. I believe they need you. I turned to her, confused. Me? Carol nodded, her gaze steady. Yes, Terry, we need you. Terry vividly recalls the days leading up to Josephine's passing, when they were researching a new treatment for her cancer. The plan involved a bone marrow transplant, combined with chemotherapy, a complicated and costly procedure, but it was a chance for survival. Right, Carol, Terry replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Harmony nodded, her gaze fixed on the floor as she spoke quietly. Our budget for Mackenzie's care is tight, but we'll manage. After everything that's happened between us, you might think I'm selfish, but Mackenzie wouldn't let me ask you for money. I wouldn't ask unless it was absolutely necessary. But for this procedure, we're wondering if you would consider being tested to see if you're a match to donate bone marrow for her. Terry's heart sank. There it was, his daughter, the one who had caused him so much pain, now needed his help. The very thought of saving her life seemed almost too much to bear. He looked at Mackenzie, who stared back at him with fear in her eyes, fear that he might refuse to even take the test, fear that he might reject her entirely. After everything they'd been through, he couldn't blame her for being scared. Terry, too, was torn. The silence in the room stretched on as they both wrestled with their emotions. Melody, ever the calming presence, gently traced her fingers on his hand, and Harmony held him close, offering her strength. Kim, sensing the gravity of the moment, spoke softly. Terry, could you take Carol and Mackenzie inside for a few minutes? I need to talk to my wives. Of course, little brother, Kim replied with a sigh, her protective nature shining through as she ushered Carol and Mackenzie inside. Once the door clicked shut, Terry turned to his wives. What do you think I should do? He asked, his voice thick with emotion. Harmony's expression was heavy. Mackenzie is definitely not well, she said, her eyes distant. Her skin is pale and she's weak. The signs are similar to what your mum had. It's hard to watch. Terry swallowed hard, the memories of his mother's battle coming to the forefront of his mind. But what do you think I should do? He repeated, his voice barely a whisper. Melody exhaled slowly, her voice soft yet firm. I understand. Both of them hurt you deeply. Honestly, when I heard Carol speak, I felt like leaping across the table. But Mackenzie is still your daughter. She needs help, Terry. She's sick, and there's a chance to save her. Could you really turn your back on her, even after everything? Terry leaned back, staring at the sky, letting Melody's words sink in. I can't let my emotions dictate my actions, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. When I look at Mackenzie, I see my little girl, frightened and in pain. I thought I had moved on from this, but the truth is, I haven't. He wrapped his arms around both women, drawing them closer. I'm not strong enough to face this alone, he admitted, his voice barely audible. Harmony's voice was a gentle reassurance in the storm. We're here for you. You don't have to do this by yourself. Melody echoed her sentiment, squeezing his hand. We love you, Terry, Melody added, her voice steady. But I think there's one thing you need to do first. Terry looked at her, his brow furrowing. What's that? You need to talk to Mackenzie. Just the two of you, Melody said, her eyes locked on his. Harmony nodded in agreement. You found some sort of closure with Carol, but you and Mackenzie haven't had that chance. You both need it. The thought of facing Mackenzie filled him with dread. He wasn't ready to revisit their painful past. I can't. I don't think I'm ready, Terry murmured, his voice faltering. Melody embraced him, her voice tender. I know it's hard, but you can do this. You need to do this for her and for you. Terry turned away, his thoughts swirling. What about Carol? He asked, trying to deflect the conversation. Forget about Carol, Melody replied sharply, her usual kindness slipping away. She deserves everything for what she did to you, but Mackenzie, she's still your daughter. Don't you think she deserves a chance to fight? Terry sighed deeply, The weight of the decision pressed down on him like 1,000 bricks. "I hate this. It feels unfair, bringing Mom into it," he said softly. Melody blushed, but she didn't back down. "I don't like Mackenzie. Talking to her on the phone made that much clear, but I can't stand the thought of her fading away." Terry turned to Harmony, seeking a second opinion. "Do you agree?" "I do," she replied, her voice gentle but firm. "You need to talk to her. You didn't get closure with Mackenzie the way you did with Carol. This is different." Terry closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "Okay, could you both ask her to join me?" Melody and Harmony stood, pressing a kiss to his cheek before heading inside. Terry stayed behind, sipping his drink as he gazed out at the backyard. His mind raced, unsure of what to expect. A few minutes later, he heard the back door creak open. Soft footsteps approached, and Mackenzie slowly sat down next to him. She handed him a drink. "Melody told me to bring you this," she said, her voice almost shy. "Your other drink would be empty." Terry took the drink from her, nodding in thanks. "And you're not drinking?" he asked, noticing her juice. "I can't. Not with my medication," Mackenzie replied, her voice soft. "But when I turned 18, I started drinking rum and coke like you. I usually went for Bundy, because Kraken was too expensive." Terry chuckled softly. "Rum, huh?" Mackenzie sighed. "I know it sounds bad, after everything that happened, but when I drank it I felt like I had a little piece of you with me." They sat in silence, a palpable awkwardness between them, but as they both looked out at the garden, Terry broke the silence. "So what are you studying?" he asked, trying to shift the conversation. Mackenzie hesitated, then answered, "I had to drop out this year because of my treatment, but I was studying applied mathematics. I wanted to work in crypto or data modeling, blockchain, stuff like that." Terry laughed softly. "I don't understand most of what you just said." Mackenzie smiled weakly, a faint cough escaping her lips reminding him so much of her mother. "I know it's a lot, but I wanted to make something of myself." Terry's heart swelled with a mix of pride and sadness. Then Mackenzie turned to him, her eyes searching his. "I really messed everything up, didn't I, Dad?" His heart clenched at the word Dad. He hadn't heard it in so long, and it stirred something deep inside him. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his emotions in check. "Yes, Pumpkin," he said softly, his voice thick. "You really did." Tears welled up in Mackenzie's eyes, and they began to fall freely. The sound of her sobs filled the quiet evening air, and Terry sat there, quietly watching her as his own heart broke. Rewritten story in American English. Over the years, I had read through many things, but something finally clicked. I turned to him and asked, "Can I ask you something?" "You don't have to answer if you don't want to." His voice softened as he responded, "If you really want to know, no matter how much it might hurt, I'll tell you. If I can." Her voice trembled, almost begging for understanding. "Months after I left, I returned to visit your grandmother. You didn't know, but she had just gone through her first round of cancer treatments. You saw me at Maitland Central, but what you didn't realize was that Mackenzie had just received some difficult news." She looked down, clearly embarrassed, as I waited for her to continue. I could see the confusion in her face. "What happened?" I asked. "If you were so upset, why did you treat me like that?" It took her a moment to respond. I could see the shame, the pain, and even a hint of anger in her expression as she slowly began speaking. "Do you remember the first time I saw you after everything happened? You were laughing at something on your phone. It had been months since I last saw you. If you think back to that day when we talked after the divorce, before you came Heredo, you remember?" I nodded, prompting her to continue. "I saw you by your truck that day. You really let both Mom and me have it," she continued. "I didn't understand why you didn't want me to be your daughter. I cried for days because it hurt so much, but now I get it. I pushed you away, but I was also angry because you just left. I didn't know how to deal with that." I wanted to speak, but Mackenzie raised her hand, signaling for me to pause. She shook her head slightly. "I know now. You left because we hurt you, just like Mum said. I'm so sorry. The three of you each in our own way tried to break you. And we did, we really did." Her voice faltered as she spoke. She paused for a long time, her eyes filled with pain. "When you hit the truck, I could see how much you had suffered, and when you left, I didn't understand it. It never got better. Honestly, Dad, I still haven't fully come to terms with it. But when I saw you that morning at the cafe, laughing, I felt like it was all unfair. Watching you smile, I thought I never mattered to you. You looked so happy, and I wasn't." Her voice wavered as she hesitated before asking, "I know it may not matter now, but can you tell me what made you laugh that day?" I smiled slightly, the memory still fresh. "Sure," I replied, pulling out my phone. As I scrolled through my photos, I found the one I was looking for. It was a picture of the girls Melody and Harmony taking care of me after my accident. I hadn't explained everything to Mackenzie yet, but the girls had been so kind, joking with me while I recovered. I showed her the photo of the two girls laughing, their faces covered with a sheet. Mackenzie smiled, her expression softening. "You really got lucky with them." But then her smile faded. "Anyway," she continued, "seeing you there smiling just made me feel worse. I was already upset, and Mom and Morrison were right behind me, talking badly about you. They kept saying things about you running away, about how you had abandoned us." She sighed. "I lost it. Morrison was always putting you down, calling you names. Mom always agreed with him. When I saw you laughing, I got angry. I thought, if I was sad, you shouldn't be happy. I didn't care. I just wanted to hurt you back." "I'm sorry, Dad," she said, her voice breaking. "I went too far." "Yes, you did," I replied, feeling the weight of her words. I saw the hurt in her eyes, and it was clear how much she had suffered too. She continued, her voice distant. "When we left the cafe and went home, Morrison was furious. He was yelling about how he was going to ruin you. You had already cost him a lot of money when you walked out on him at the hospital. There was a wealthy couple, William and Mather, who supported the local hospital. If we lost their support, we would lose a lot of funding." Her eyes widened in realization. "Did you know that back then?" she asked. I shook my head and smiled. I met the girls much later, but let's focus on you for now." Mackenzie nodded, then shifted her tone. "The next day, when Mum and I came to see you, you seemed like a completely different person. It felt like the old you was back, not the angry one I saw at the cafe. What happened?" She paused, then sighed. "That night, I felt terrible. I cried myself to sleep. I realized that I had hurt you again. But when I heard Mum talking about going to my grandparents to get my university money from you, I begged her to take me with her. All I wanted to do was apologize, to make things right. I wanted to escape the mess my life had become." We both sat quietly, reflecting on the pain we had shared. After a moment, I spoke. "When you and your mum left that day, I still hoped we could reconnect. But then your birthday came." Her voice faltered, full of regret. "I messed that up too, didn't I?" I laughed softly, my heart heavy. "Yes, you did. That's when I felt all the warmth and love I had for you fade away." I paused, or so I thought. She looked at me, trembling slightly. I wanted to comfort her, but the words didn't come. We both had to sift through our shared memories, searching for any hope of healing. "I know now," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Back then, I thought I was justified in everything I did, but now I just feel ashamed. I remember the guy, he'd only been home for a couple of days after being released on bail. He and Mom were shouting your name, but for all the wrong reasons. They blamed you for everything. They said there wasn't much money left." She paused, clearly ashamed. "I was used to getting new things. Mum had taught me to expect them. I didn't know he had hurt you." She stopped for a moment, looking away. "He really did, didn't he?" "Yes," I replied quietly, shaking my head. "He almost killed me. Twice. My heart stopped twice in the ER, but I'm still here thanks to a wonderful medical team and some incredible care from Harmony." Mackenzie was silent for a moment. Finally she spoke, her voice filled with regret. "About that message I sent," she groaned, clearly dreading the conversation. "Dad, I want to hear more about what he did, but I know this is about you." She paused, the weight of her guilt still heavy. "When I saw your number on my birthday, I knew it was you. But just 10 minutes earlier, Mom and the guy were yelling about you. I listened to your voicemail, and I got so angry. I thought, how could you do this to us? Did you hate us that much? He'd been telling me that now that I was 17, I could take you to court for money, so I sent that text." She shook her head, her voice quieter now. "It was one of the worst things I've ever done, but it wasn't until we were in that courtroom that I realized I was wrong. I didn't know the truth until that day. I never let myself see it. I never understood." Her voice trailed off, and the weight of everything between us hung in the air. I could feel the pain in her voice as she spoke, her words breaking through the silence like shards of glass. "I never thought I'd lose you, not until I heard he'd hurt you," she confessed. "That was the moment I felt my world shift. It was as though everything around me was crumbling. I could still see it so clearly." Mackenzie broke down in tears as we relayed our story in court. She cried without stopping, even when the session was paused, and they moved her and her mother to another hallway. Every word from her lips was laced with sorrow. I didn't even hear the lawyer's explanation about the trust fund offer until 3 days later. I was lost, staring at you, not processing anything. When I finally understood the terms, I lost control. I rejected the deal outright. My mother was the one who had pressured me into signing it, telling me I'd never be loved by you again and that I should just take your money. I remember her gaze cold and calculating watching me, her words hanging in the air. I could have torn up that agreement 1,000,000 times just to hear you speak my name again, to feel your arms around me. I didn't care about the money. I just wanted to go back to those moments when you loved me and I was still your daughter. Then the dam broke. Mackenzie sobbed uncontrollably, her small body shaking with each heartbreaking cry. I just wanted to be your little girl again, she choked out, clutching herself as her breaths became erratic. She rocked back and forth, lost in her grief. I stood there, frozen, trying to keep my composure, but my resolve shattered when I saw the depth of her pain. The love I'd thought had been extinguished flared up inside me like a wildfire. I couldn't bear to see her like this. With a surge of emotion, I pulled her towards me. She felt weightless, like a fragile bird, and I held her close, my arms encircling her trembling body. Her sobs turned into anguished wails as she clung to me, her hands gripping my shirt with desperate strength. I rocked her back and forth, treating her as if she was still the little girl I once held in my arms. Though she was 22 now, I didn't want to let her go. We stayed like that, her cries mixing with mine, our tears merging and falling onto the floor below us. "Daddy," she sobbed, and in that moment I couldn't imagine ever letting go of her. As the night wore on, our cries eventually faded into sniffles. Mackenzie lay against me, her breathing calmer, though she still clung to my side. I held her as the moon rose, and I felt a sense of healing that I hadn't known was possible. I closed my eyes, swaying gently as I held her. That's when Melody placed a hand on my shoulder. She smiled softly, pride in her eyes, not just for me, but for Mackenzie as well. "I'm sorry, my love," Melody said, her voice filled with understanding. "I know this is a special moment for the two of you, but the kids are waiting to say goodnight." Mackenzie sniffled, looking up at me before giving a small, tentative smile. She glanced at Melody, still a bit anxious, but then turned her attention back to me. "It's okay, Dad," she said softly. "We both needed this, but if you need to put the kids to bed, promise me you'll come back so we can keep talking." I stood up, then turned to Mackenzie. "Actually, would you like to come with me and help tuck in your brothers and sisters?" Both girls gasped. "Dad, I don't know if I can. There's so much—" Mackenzie trailed off, but I gently interrupted. "I know, sweetheart, but I'd rather have you with me right now. We can talk more after everyone is in bed." Melody helped both of us to our feet, and together we walked back inside. As we entered, everyone noticed us. We had been outside for nearly an hour, and it was clear from the redness in both Mackenzie's and my eyes that we had been crying. Carol stood up quickly, walking toward us with a warm smile. "It's good to see you two talking," she said, but then she glanced at the kids and nodded. "It's bedtime for them, though, and Mackenzie and I still need to talk." I gave her a soft shake of my head. "I understand, Carol, but this might take a while. Mackenzie and I have some important things to discuss." Carol's smile faltered, and she turned to me with a frown. "What do you mean, Terry? You're asking me to leave?" "No," I replied firmly. "Mackenzie and I want to continue this conversation tonight, and we need some space. You don't need to be here for that. Mackenzie can stay here tonight, and we'll look after her." Carol's expression hardened, and I saw her temper flare up again. "What do you mean, Terry? I brought my daughter here. You can't just throw me out." Before I could respond, Harmony stepped forward, her tone sharp. "Terry, the kids are ready for their bedtime story." "Don't take too long," she said with a smile, before turning on her heel and walking away. I could hear Melody's soft laugh behind me, knowing exactly what I was thinking. Mackenzie cleared her throat, breaking the tension. "Mom, it's okay. I'm not a kid anymore. I'm 22, and Dad's family will take care of me. We can meet in town tomorrow." She straightened up, but still held my hand, her voice steady despite the tension. "But right now, I need to have this talk with Dad. It's been almost 7 years, and I can't let this chance slip away." Carol's face twisted with frustration. "No buts, Mackenzie," she began to argue, but Mackenzie interrupted her. "Mom, you're not helping right now. What Dad and I are discussing is important. Having you here will only make it harder." I watched Carol's face harden. She probably thought that if she left, Mackenzie would follow. But the truth was, Mackenzie had already made up her mind. With one last firm squeeze of my arm, Mackenzie led her mother out of the room before things could escalate further. As I sat down to read The Very Hungry Caterpillar to the kids, Mackenzie reappeared, walking in with Melody. I paused, letting Melody sit next to me. Harmony took her place on my left, and the room settled into a quieter rhythm as I continued the story, Mackenzie beside me, her presence a quiet comfort amidst the turmoil. Mackenzie settled herself on the floor, surrounded by the eager faces of the children. As the story unfolded, the young ones, filled with curiosity, couldn't help but wonder about the new woman in their midst. Adam, John, Grace, and Beth all stared intently, their eyes filled with questions. "Everyone, this is Mackenzie Morrison, your older sister," I introduced, my voice tinged with a hint of pride. "She's my daughter from my first marriage, before I met your mothers." Before I could continue, Mackenzie corrected me gently. "Actually, it's Mackenzie Brown," she said, a soft smile playing on her lips. I raised my eyebrows, surprised by the correction, but nodded in acknowledgement. "Right, Mackenzie Brown." We introduced her cousins, Candice and Holly, to Mackenzie, and for the next few moments the children were unstoppable with their questions. They were curious about how Mackenzie could be both my daughter and a grown-up. "Is she a grown-up like the other adults?" Adam asked with wide-eyed innocence. Then, as if trying to make sense of it all, young Grace asked the most uncomfortable question of the evening. "Sister Mackenzie, what's wrong with your hair?" It had been noticeable to all of us that Mackenzie hadn't removed her hat the entire night, but the moment she took it off, the room fell silent. A wig, woven from brown hair, was attached to the inside of the hat, and beneath it, Mackenzie's scalp was completely bald, a side effect of her cancer treatments. With a gentle hand, Mackenzie touched Grace's arm and said, "Grace, I'm really sick, and the medicine I take makes my hair fall out. It doesn't hurt much, but I try to stay brave." Adam, ever the thoughtful one, asked, "Does it hurt?" "A little," Mackenzie replied with a soft smile, "but it's okay." The children's questions continued, innocent and endless, until Kim walked into the room. She paused, her eyes widening when she saw Mackenzie's bald head. After a brief moment, Kim clapped her hands together. "All right, kids, that's enough for now. Give Mackenzie some space," she said, her tone firm but kind. "You can talk to her in the morning. Now it's time for bed." After the children were tucked into bed, Mackenzie stood up to give my father a warm, heartfelt hug. When he saw her bald head, the truth hit him like a wave. He realized that Mackenzie, too, was battling the same cancer that had taken my mother. I watched, my heart heavy, as he grew emotional, holding his granddaughter for the first time in nearly 7 years. They shared a quiet conversation, and before long, John, along with William and Martha, said their good nights and retired for the evening. Martha embraced me gently as she left, whispering, "I know this is hard, Terry, and I can see you're confused. But you're doing the right thing. She needs you to help her heal." I nodded, holding my mother-in-law tightly before she left. Paul and Kim also assured us they would listen to the kids and allow us more time for important conversations. Outside, the cool evening air wrapped around us as Melody, Harmony, Mackenzie, and I sat down together. Melody, with her usual warmth, asked, "Mackenzie, would it be okay if we sit with you and your dad?" Mackenzie nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. "Of course." "Sorry, I can't always tell you two apart." Melody laughed. "That's all right," Melody replied with a grin. "Most people get confused. I'm Melody, and this is my sister Harmony." She leaned in closer and whispered, "If you want an easy way to remember us, I usually sit on his right, and Harmony always sits on his left." "Why is that?" Mackenzie asked, intrigued. I couldn't help but smile as I told her the story of how Harmony had taken care of me during a storm years ago. It's just how it happened. When I first got hurt, Harmony was always there, taking care of my left side, so that side became hers. Melody sat on my right, and that's how we've always sat. Mackenzie wiped a tear from her cheek, her eyes softening. She understood now, seeing the bond we shared. She looked up at me, her gaze full of empathy for the pain that had passed through our family. "So you three are married?" Mackenzie asked, her voice full of wonder. "Yes," we replied in unison, smiling at each other. "How does that work?" she asked, her curiosity still bubbling over. "Do you sleep in the same room or separate?" Melody chuckled softly. "We all sleep in the same bed," she explained. "From the moment we met, we've always slept together." Mackenzie blinked in confusion. "So how does it all work?" she asked shyly. The girls laughed, and Melody, always the playful one, leaned in. "Are you asking about romance?" she teased. Mackenzie's face turned bright red. "Is that what you meant, Mel?" Suddenly, Melody grew serious, her tone shifting. "Mackenzie," she said softly, "Harmony and I both share your dad. There's no division between us. We don't get close in the way you might think, But we both love him completely, and we work together as a family. We share him. I caught Mackenzie's eyes, my own heart aching at the rawness of the conversation. Harmony added, her voice steady and kind, "In this family, we don't shy away from the difficult things. We talk through them, so we can heal and move forward together." Mackenzie looked down, the weight of her past actions clearly weighing on her. "I don't think Aunt Kim likes me much," she murmured, almost to herself. "That's understandable," Harmony replied gently, her hand resting on Mackenzie's shoulder. "Kim and Paul will need time to adjust to you. You've hurt your dad, and they've been there for him. But we deal with it, together, and we move on." Mackenzie nodded quietly, fighting back tears. Harmony, ever the loving presence, moved closer and wrapped her arms around Mackenzie, pulling her into a comforting hug. "It's okay, sweetie. Let it all out," she whispered, kissing the top of Mackenzie's smooth head. As Mackenzie clung to Harmony, the flood of emotions poured out, but after a while, Mackenzie looked up at me, her eyes red and pleading for understanding. Harmony held her, comforting her in silence, until Mackenzie had cried out her sorrow. Melody, leaning against me, smiled softly, her arm around my shoulder, as I watched Mackenzie, finally allowing herself the release she so desperately needed. As I held Mackenzie's arm, guiding her back towards Harmony, I gently brought it down to her lap. "I'm so sorry, everyone," I whispered. "Daddy, I love you so much, and even though I can't undo what I've done, I want to try and make things better for you with the time I have left." Harmony, with a soft smile, reassured her. "It's going to be all right. We're here for you, no matter what happens next. We hope everything improves, and that you have plenty of time to make things right with your father. But no more negative thoughts, okay?" Mackenzie returned Harmony's small smile, and Harmony handed her a napkin from the table, gently offering it to wipe away the tears on her face. "Agreed," my daughter said quietly. We lingered in that moment for a while, the room filled with a silence that spoke louder than words. Melody, who had been nestled against me, rested her head on my shoulder, occasionally kissing it in gentle intervals. After the third kiss, I leaned in and kissed her softly on the lips. Mackenzie, who had been observing us with an amused glint in her eye, couldn't help but giggle. "Well, I guess it's true. My dad likes redheads." We all laughed, but Melody, ever the tease, added, "I think that's pretty obvious, Mackenzie." Then, with a playful glint in her eyes, she continued, "No, seriously. Redheads. My mum was one too." Mackenzie looked at her with a raised brow. "We've met Carol, and she's not a redhead. She's more of a dark blonde, almost brown." I felt my cheeks flush, realizing exactly where this conversation was going. Mackenzie caught on immediately, and I could see Harmony's knowing look directed at me. Suddenly, both of my wives chorused in unison, "No way," their voices harmonizing perfectly, as if they had discovered something profound. I laughed, shaking my head. "I guess you could say the carpet doesn't match the curtains." Melody playfully swatted my arm. "You sly dog, all these years, and you never said a word." "Well, to be honest, I started with a sheepish grin. I've been a little preoccupied with 2 other redheads and trying to forget my ex-wife." Both girls gave me teasing looks, but Mackenzie chimed in with a teasing, "Dad, that's a bit too much information." Melody, now facing Mackenzie, asked, "How did you figure that out, Mackenzie?" Mackenzie looked slightly embarrassed, her face reddening. "I guess you're pretty open about bodies, and I'm starting to learn not to be shy about it. I had a conversation with Mom at 14. I usually have dark brown hair, but there was always a bit of red in certain areas. Mom said it was normal, and that I took the color from her." We all chuckled at that, but Mackenzie's tone shifted as she grew more serious. If I had known then what I understand now, I would have seen that Mom was already with someone else. "I would have done more to stay by you, Dad, no matter what. I spent so many years feeling unloved, like I was just a burden." The weight of her words settled over us, and we exchanged glances, the unspoken understanding that the man Mom was with could never care for her the way a real father should. We all believed Carol had always placed her own needs first, even above Mackenzie. With a deep sigh, Mackenzie continued, "I know Mum loves me and cares, but sometimes, especially with my illness, I feel like I'm more of a reflection of her image. At first, I was just the new daughter of Dr. Someone Special, and now I'm the daughter with cancer, as if I'm just the pity case that makes people feel sorry for her." She shook her head. "But the past few hours with all of you, I've laughed and cried, and that hurt as much as my cancer treatments. It made me think about how I've treated my dad all these years." Her gaze flickered to me before she lowered her eyes to the table again. "But none of you turned your back on me. With Mom, whenever things got tough, She would leave the room and let me face it alone, as if I embarrassed her. I felt like a burden, like I wasn't enough for her. Looking up at us all, she whispered, "I know I've wronged you, especially you, Dad. I've been disrespectful, and I owe you all an apology. Despite my mistakes, I felt more love here, in less than a day, than I've ever felt in 7 years with Mom." We all fell into a silence, allowing the truth of her words to sink in. I finally spoke, my voice calm but reassuring. "We'll get through this, Pumpkin. It's going to take time, but we'll get there, okay?" My wives nodded in agreement, and after a few moments of quiet reflection, Harmony asked, "Why is your last name Brown now, Mackenzie?" Before Mackenzie could answer, I replied, "It's her mum's maiden name." Mackenzie just nodded. I couldn't reach out to Dad and ask if I could take my real last name back after everything that happened. So, when Mom divorced that man, I let go of the name Morrison and took her maiden name instead. A quiet sob escaped from Mackenzie's lips. Even then, Mom wasn't happy about it. She thought I should keep the name Morrison because he legally adopted me, and she believed I should keep the money that came with it, since she wouldn't get much in the divorce. We sat in silence for a long while, each of us lost in our thoughts. Eventually, we shifted the conversation, recalling happier times and fun memories. We talked about how we first met, our early dates, and the surprise on people's faces when they realized the three of us were together. We shared stories of our trips to the US and Europe, how the girls tried to teach me to ski, and how many times I fell before discovering how much I loved snowboarding. Later, as the evening wore on, I noticed Mackenzie's tired eyes. She was eager to keep talking, but I could tell she was worn out. I led her to the guest bedroom and showed her where the bathroom and towels were. "Grandpa's room is down the hall, and ours is next to the kids' room. If you need anything, okay, Pumpkin?" I smiled at her. Before I could say anything else, she hugged me tightly. "I love you, Daddy," she whispered, her voice soft but full of sincerity. "I love you too, Mackenzie," I replied, holding her close. "But now, it's time for sleep. We'll talk more in the morning, all right?" She nodded, and we exchanged good nights. As I entered my own bedroom, I found the girls already fast asleep. I quickly showered, slipping into a pair of light cotton shorts, and climbed into bed. The girls snuggled up beside me, and I couldn't help but smile. "I checked on the kids a little while ago," Melody said, her smile warm. "They're not in their beds anymore. They're all piled up on the floor. Uncle Paul set it up for them." I kissed her on the forehead and said, "Thank you, my love. I feel bad that all of this happened on family BBQ night." "Don't worry about it," Harmony replied, leaning in for a kiss. "It's all going to be okay." As Harmony leaned in for a kiss, she softly whispered, "Tonight was unexpected, but I saw something I never thought I'd witness." Both Melody and I raised our eyebrows in surprise as she continued, "I saw a part of you come back to life." There was a sense of relief in her words. "As much as we love you, Mackenzie's absence has left a void, and tonight we saw something restored within you." I felt a warmth that seemed to settle deep within my soul. That night I fell asleep cradling my wives in my arms, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't known in a long time. The following morning, the entire family came together to prepare the children for breakfast. We made our way to town, bustling with energy. Harmony, Mackenzie, and I arrived at the hospital early for a series of tests, hoping that my marrow and plasma might be a match for Mackenzie's treatment. The results would take about 2 days to return. Carol called Mackenzie, and as the conversation unfolded, Mackenzie told her that she was with me, undergoing tests, and would update her on their whereabouts later. But as I stood there listening to Mackenzie's voice, I couldn't ignore the subtle tension between her and Carol. It was a distance I had never noticed before, a widening gap that seemed to grow with every passing moment. It was as if, in our process of reconnecting, Mackenzie and Carol were drifting further apart. Perhaps it was because of some painful truths we were uncovering, truths about past misunderstandings. Later, we met the rest of the family at a favorite breakfast spot. It was chaotic in the best way, children running around, parents and grandparents sipping coffee, and the waitstaff scrambling to keep up with the demands of a busy restaurant. But amidst it all, there was a palpable sense of connection. Mackenzie, who had always preferred to sit near me during these gatherings, had her usual spot next to me. Melody and Harmony, understanding her need for closeness, often gave up their seats so Mackenzie could be at my side. Little Grace, our youngest, always seemed to gravitate toward Mackenzie. Whether it was during a meal or simply sitting on our laps, Grace's presence always lingered near her older half-sister. It was a bond, inexplicable yet so clear, one that existed between Grace and Mackenzie. Carol, on the other hand, arrived a little later, but her presence was fleeting. I could sense the discomfort in the air as Mackenzie brushed off her attempts to hover, constantly assuring her mother that she didn't need to be so protective. Carol, ever the one to speak about how tough things had been for her as a single mother, made the mistake of emphasizing her sacrifices for Mackenzie's care. But this time, no one, least of all Mackenzie, paid attention to her complaints. 2 days passed, and the test results came back. The tension between Carol and me escalated as I learned that I was a perfect match for Mackenzie's treatment. If we moved quickly, we could integrate my donation into her plan without major complications. Mackenzie's doctor was already in Sydney, and I had taken the week off work. The plan was to fly there in 2 days to begin the first stage of the treatment. But when we shared our plans with Carol, she was less than thrilled. "You've got to be kidding, Terry," she snapped, visibly upset. "Mackenzie and I can't just drop everything and go to Sydney. I need time to make arrangements." We were sitting together on the back deck as Harmony helped Mackenzie pack, and Melody entertained the younger kids with Paul and Kim. "Carol," I said, trying to keep my calm, "this isn't open for discussion. We have a chance to do this now, and we're taking it, no matter what you've planned." Her face flushed with frustration. "I need to make arrangements, hotels, travel plans. I can't just leave." "That's not your concern," I replied, my voice steady. "You don't have to be there. Mackenzie and I will handle it." The words stung, and I saw the anger rising in her eyes. "What right do you have to make decisions like this?" she demanded, her voice filled with contempt. "You're not even her father anymore, so stay out of it." I could feel Mackenzie's discomfort as her mother crossed her arms and glared at me. The exchange between Carol and I was growing more heated, but Mackenzie, her resolve unshaken, walked over and stood between us. "Mum," Mackenzie began, her voice clear but measured, "would you really stop me from getting the best care just because it doesn't fit your plans?" Carol opened her mouth to respond, but Mackenzie continued, her words sharp. "And don't speak that way to someone who can save my life, whether he's a stranger or my ex-husband." For a moment, Carol stood frozen, caught off guard by Mackenzie's unexpected support. "Well, no, dear," she mumbled, clearly flustered. "I didn't mean it like that. Terry's just being stubborn, and I wanted to share my side of things." Mackenzie, now sitting next to me, turned to face Carol with a look of intensity. "About those things you mentioned," she began, her voice unwavering, "it felt like you were bragging to Dad about making me give up my rights. Or was it just that you pressured a young girl to sign adoption papers that kept me away from my father for so long?" The words hung heavy in the air, a realization dawning on Carol as Mackenzie's expression grew darker. "You lied, Mum." Mackenzie's voice cracked with emotion. "For years I believed Dad wanted nothing to do with me. You and that jerk said he was just a poor plumber, not worth anything. But it was you. You lied. You cheated on Dad with that loser." Mackenzie had kept her thoughts to herself for far too long, and now they spilled out in a torrent of hurt and anger. Carol's face went pale, unable to process the flood of revelations. "When Dad and I talked, when we reconnected over the past few days, it opened my eyes," Mackenzie continued, her words slow and deliberate. "Talking to him showed me that you never really loved him, and when I think about how you treated me, playing with my feelings like that, it hurt more than what you did to him. Honestly, I wonder if you even care about me." Carol's face twisted with a mixture of confusion and denial. "Mackenzie," she began, her voice shaking, "how could you say that?" Mackenzie, calm but firm, answered, "It's easy. In these last few days, reconnecting with Dad, talking with Melody and Harmony, meeting my younger brothers and sisters, I've felt more love and acceptance here than I ever did with you. With you and that man, who I can't even bring myself to call a father." "Mackenzie Grace Brown," Carol gasped, standing in shock. "How dare you?" Mackenzie's response was cold, almost detached. "Yes, Mum, how dare I? Who took me to the hospital? Who made sure I got my medication? Who drove me here to ask my ex-husband for help?" Mackenzie's voice was steady, her resolve unwavering. Carol opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The conversation was over. Carol's expression was one of confusion, but I pressed on. "I've built a solid life here, a home that's mine, and despite all that has transpired, I might have the opportunity to repair my relationship with Mackenzie. I can help her if it means I need to distance myself from you to protect her emotions, then so be it. You need to understand that." Carol's gaze was fixed on me, unwavering. I was ready to do whatever it took, even if it meant breaking her heart. Mackenzie let out a laugh next to me, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, before Carol could respond. "Mum," Mackenzie began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion, "I know this will upset you, but it's happening. Dad's taking me to Sydney tonight, and we're going through with the procedure tomorrow evening. I trust him. I believe what Dad said. Maybe it's better if you return home for now." He can take care of me while I go through this." Carol's protests continued, her voice rising with each word. She seemed unable to see beyond her own feelings, her objections rooted in a selfish desire to hold on. But the more she resisted, the further apart she and Mackenzie drifted. The rift had grown, deeper and more painful than I had ever realized. From what Mackenzie had shared with me, as well as the stories I'd heard since that first weekend of healing, I began to understand the true gravity of the situation. What Carol and her partner had done to Mackenzie bordered on cruelty, and I needed to be clear here. I knew that families argue, and disagreements were natural. I, myself, had been married twice to fiery, strong-willed women whose personalities could bring anyone to their knees. But families, no matter their differences, had a responsibility to protect each other, and Carol had failed in that responsibility. Leaving your child alone in a big city for hours with no one to care for them, that was unforgivable, but Carol hadn't seen it that way, and that's when everything began to unravel. Later that evening, Mackenzie, Melody and I left for Sydney's airport. Harmony had wanted to join us, but someone had to stay behind with the children. It seemed she lost at rock, paper, scissors, the outcome of which had her sister heading with us instead. The procedure itself was relatively straightforward. I was put under anesthesia, and they extracted marrow from my body to insert it into Mackenzie's. The hope was that her body would accept the transplant. After her chemotherapy sessions, I would donate blood regularly, with the aim of speeding up her recovery. I didn't understand all the medical jargon, but it had worked for 3 patients in the US with similar conditions, so we moved forward. After the operation, Mackenzie surprised us by choosing to come back to Bathurst with us, a decision that took her mother completely by surprise. Carol had expected Mackenzie to return to her after the first procedure, but instead, she came to our home. The next few months were a bit strained. Mackenzie settled into our house, though it took some time for us to adjust to her presence. She had her friends send over most of her belongings, unwilling to trust Carol with that task. She spent a lot of time with the kids, and joined me and my daughters in the evenings. We shared stories, often tearful ones, about her time with her mother and the things she'd endured. Melody, Harmony, and I were stunned by some of the things Mackenzie revealed. But the most profound moments came when Mackenzie and I worked together to rebuild our relationship. It wasn't easy, but having her back in my life was something I cherished deeply. Then, my birthday arrived. I woke up early, a strange sensation filling me. Melody was leaning over me, and I was still trying to make sense of the moment when I realized she was celebrating my birthday with me. Harmony was beside me too, contributing to the special feeling. The surprises kept coming, each one overwhelming but exciting. After a shower and getting dressed, we gathered for breakfast with the kids, William, Martha, and even Mackenzie, who all greeted me with cheeky smiles and excited shouts of "Happy birthday, Daddy." For the next 20 minutes, I was completely caught up in the joy of their presence as I opened their colorful, crayon-scribbled gifts. Melody gifted me a new Remington 308 rifle, a nod to the target shooting hobby I had recently taken up. Harmony gave me a 16x50 scope, which must have cost nearly as much as the rifle itself. William and Martha handed me a spotting scope, perfect for the shooting range, but Mackenzie's gift was the most unexpected. She approached me with a nervous look, sitting beside the gifts on the coffee table. "What's wrong, Pumpkin?" I asked, concerned. Without a word, she pulled out a small, present-old, worn wrapping paper with tears. Tears filled her eyes as she handed it to me. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "This is for you, Dad." I opened the card. It read, "I wrote this the week before your birthday, more than 7 years ago." Inside, the words were simple yet heartbreaking. "Dad, I don't know what I did to make you not want to see us these last few months. I miss you, but Mom says we can't talk to you because soon Stephen will be my new dad. I'm not sure I want a new dad. I miss my old one. I hope you have a happy birthday. I love you, Dad. Your daughter, Mackenzie." I set the card down slowly, my heart heavy with emotion. The room fell silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on all of us. Mackenzie's siblings, normally full of energy, were eerily quiet. I carefully unwrapped the gift, revealing 3 items inside: a simple black cotton shirt, a pair of cotton boxers with little hearts on them, and a small pocket knife, engraved with the words, "My dad, Terry, love, Mackenzie." I looked at Mackenzie, then back at the gift, then back at her again. "Thank you," I managed to say, before pulling her into a tight embrace. We both cried, our tears a mix of sorrow and healing. "I love you, Pumpkin," I whispered. Melody, who had read the card aloud, joined the hug, and Harmony came over too. Mackenzie had kept this gift all these years, unsure whether she'd ever be able to give it to me. Finally, little Beth came over, her tiny arms wrapping around us. She looked up at me, then to Mackenzie, and then to Melody. "Mummy, doesn't Dad like Sister Mackenzie's present?" she asked innocently. "No, sweetie," Melody replied softly. "I think Daddy loves Sister Mackenzie's gift the most." "Better than mine?" John asked, his innocent voice adding to the quiet moment. We all laughed softly. "I love all your gifts equally," I said, my heart full. "But Daddy's wanted this one for a long time, and your big sister knew just what I needed." As the morning unfolded, I finally felt the relief of a momentary break from my usual responsibilities. After getting the kids ready, Martha graciously offered to take them to daycare, allowing Melody, Harmony, and myself a brief reprieve from the constant demands of parenthood. With Mackenzie by my side, we eagerly made plans to head into town for a birthday brunch, perhaps even a little shopping if time permitted. But as we were preparing for the day ahead, the first of many unexpected twists arrived. Melody called out from the front door, "Terry, there's a man here with a package for you. He says you need to sign for it." Her voice carried a trace of curiosity, and I couldn't help but laugh. "Probably another birthday gift," I mused. "I hope this one comes with cash." I signed for the package, and the courier handed me an envelope. He said, "Thanks," but didn't move, standing there waiting. "Is there something else?" I asked, feeling the weight of his gaze. "Yes, sir," he replied. "I need you to read the paper inside and let me know which time you prefer for a meeting." I glanced at Melody, a mix of confusion and mild annoyance creeping in. "What's this about?" I muttered, opening the envelope. After skimming the letter, I couldn't help but exclaim, "You've got to be kidding me." Melody, ever the curious one, approached me, holding a pair of shoes in her hand. "What is it, baby?" she asked as she entered the room. I showed her the letter. "The guy is asking for a video meeting today," I said, almost incredulous. "Says he has something important to discuss." Melody looked over the letter, her brow furrowing. The courier explained, "He gave you 3 options for the meeting, 10:30, 12:30, or 3:30 today. He wants to use something called Microsoft Teams." I stared at the courier for a moment, a mix of frustration and disbelief in my eyes. "You're not just a delivery guy, are you?" "No, sir," he said, looking a little embarrassed. "I actually work for the Department of Corrections. If you pick a time, I'll tell you how to connect with the person on the other end." I felt a sigh escape my lips. Of course it couldn't just be a simple morning, could it? I looked at Melody, who nodded, clearly sensing the tension. "Let's just get it over with, 10:30 works." She gave me a small smile, trying to ease the frustration. The courier quickly flipped through a folder. "Do you have a computer with internet and a webcam?" he asked, looking at me expectantly. I glanced at Melody, still processing the bizarre nature of this interruption. "He does," I said simply, my mind starting to wander. As the courier prepped for the call, I felt a strange tension in the air. His words lingered in my mind, though I pushed them aside. His mention of my past, the life I had with Carol, felt like an unnecessary jab. He was trying to provoke me, but I refused to rise to the bait. "I could give her a better life," the courier had said, his tone almost triumphant. "I'm a surgeon, I make money, I have a nice house. She's beautiful, isn't she? Carol and I were meant to be together. When we got close, I knew she was mine." I maintained my composure, not letting his words get to me. "You never had a chance with her," I replied evenly. He smiled smugly. "You weren't a match for me, and I wasn't even trying. I didn't just take her from you. I made sure I adopted Mackenzie. You lost the chance to be her father." His grin grew wider. "Even now, she's living a life you could never provide. Trips, jewelry, clothes, everything you couldn't give her. And Carol? She's still waiting for me to get out so we can be a family again." I couldn't help but raise an eyebrow, though I remained calm. He had no idea what I had been doing for Mackenzie. The cancer treatments, the support I was giving her, they didn't even cross his mind. "But Mackenzie, she's doing well," the courier continued, oblivious to the tension in the room. "She asked me for advice on investments, even school choices. Your gift to her for colleges, loved it. And then she went and celebrated with her friends." He paused, letting the words settle. "A month later, she came to me. I ended up here," he gestured vaguely, "but Mackenzie is still mine." The words stung, but I didn't show it. I could hear muffled sounds from the other room, Mackenzie, no doubt, listening and growing upset with every word. She knew exactly what kind of man her biological father was. "So what is it you want from me?" I asked, my patience wearing thin. The courier leaned in, his voice lowering like he was about to share a secret. "I want to give you access," he said simply. "Access?" I echoed, confused. He sighed dramatically, as though my confusion was a great disappointment. Yes, access, Terry. His arms spread wide, like a preacher offering salvation. The gesture reminded me of the one he'd made when we'd met at Maitland Central. It hadn't worked then, and it wasn't working now. You're not part of your old family's life anymore, are you? He continued, savoring the moment. Well, I'm offering you a chance to see them again, your ex-wife, your daughter, in exchange for a little help. I scoffed. Why on earth would I want to talk to them? They left me for trips and some idea of a better life. They threw me away, so forgive me if I don't see anything special in you. But still, the question remains, why would I want to see them? The courier's smile faltered. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Because no matter how you feel about Carol, me, or especially Mackenzie, she's your blood. And when I tell you what I know, you'll want to see her more than anything else. I paused, intrigued despite myself. And what's the price? His expression shifted, a sense of triumph in his eyes. There's always a price, Terry, but once you hear what I have to say, you'll wish you'd listened earlier. I raised an eyebrow, feeling a flicker of wariness. Enough with the drama, I replied, my tone steady. You're a criminal and a user, and from what I hear, you're not doing so well in your personal life either. His smile tightened, but he said nothing more, the room falling into an unsettling silence as I awaited whatever revelation was coming next. Let's skip the pleasantries, I snapped at him, my words sharp and direct. He chuckled, thinking he had the upper hand. We're almost there, foolish plumber, he said, clearly confident. First, tell me what I owe you. All right, let's hear it, I responded, keeping my tone steady, though I could feel the amusement bubbling inside. He grinned, leaning in slightly. First, I want you to agree to pay me $100,000. It doesn't have to be all at once, I've got a few years to collect. Just pay me something for my trouble, and we'll call it a deal. I nearly laughed, but I held it back. Sounds like you've got more than one request, I observed. He didn't skip a beat. I do indeed. I also want you to get your sister to talk to the DA, see if she can work some magic to get me a shorter sentence. So, you want money and some help with your sentence in exchange for a juicy tidbit of info about my daughter, I thought. Something I'm supposed to care about. We won't even get into the legality of all this, but it must be quite the secret. His smile widened, as if he thought he had me cornered. You do realize I could just call Carol or Mackenzie myself, right? Did you forget that little detail? I said with a knowing look. His grin faltered, but he quickly recovered. You can't, he countered, his voice dripping with confidence. They have new numbers, and they moved far away. You're just a plumber with no way of reaching them. He had no idea. He must have missed or ignored the fact that I had a new job. So you're saying I can't get to them unless I go through you? Exactly. I smirked. Then why would I want to do that? His smile began to fade as he shifted uncomfortably, realizing he wasn't quite getting the reaction he was hoping for. He leaned in a bit more, trying to make his case. Mackenzie's sick. She can barely move. If you help me, I can put you in touch with Carol and Mackenzie so you can say goodbye to her. I set up this meeting today as a gift to you, on your birthday, no less. You help me, and I'll help you see her one last time. I raised an eyebrow, my laugh building up from my gut. It started as a chuckle, then escalated into a full belly laugh. I slapped the table a few times, wiping the tears from my eyes. Oh, you think that's going to get to me? Please, I said, wiping my face and waving him off. It's funny, but that doesn't mean I care. If anything, it's the opposite. He looked puzzled as he tried to regroup. Terry, this isn't funny. Mackenzie is sick, and you need me to connect you if you want to say goodbye. If you don't, it will haunt you forever. I wouldn't want to stop my daughter from seeing her father one last time. I waved my hand dismissively again, signaling the girls to come in. I think you're mistaken, I said, my tone cold and detached. I don't need your help, and I certainly don't need you trying to manipulate me with some sob story. No, this has been the most entertaining conversation I've had in a long time. As the girls walked into the room, I couldn't help but take a moment to admire them. Melody, dressed in a soft blue dress, her hair neatly pulled back. Harmony in a sunny yellow, her hair styled just like her sister's, and Mackenzie, dressed casually in jeans and a summer top. The atmosphere shifted as they stood beside me, ready to head out. I've known for a long time that Mackenzie dreams of me, I said, turning my gaze back to him. You might have charmed and deceived my wife, but let me tell you, she could never forget the happiness I brought her, even if it was only in her dreams. It's you who ended up in this tough spot, Not me. He seemed unsettled by my words, but he recovered with a bitter laugh. But you're just a plumber. He spat, clearly struggling to believe what I was saying. You're not even married to them. Get lost, liar. Harmony chuckled, stepping forward with a teasing smile. Sorry, but Terry is our guy, and trust me, it's not just his charm. He has skills that really impress us, she said, winking at me. I gave a small, prideful smile and glanced sideways at her. You see, I have no interest in reconnecting with Carol. That brings us to the second part of your request. I love being a plumber. It's honest work, even if it means dealing with some pretty gross stuff. But I've been much more than just a plumber for years now. I leaned back in my chair, savoring the moment. Since leaving Matland, I've been running quality control for Delzingd Park. In fact, these lovely ladies here are the daughters of the owner and the future leaders of the company. You might remember William and Martha Dios, the nice couple who were with me when we first met. I let that sink in, watching the realization hit him. Yes, that's right, they're my wives. So, if you think I'm broke, you're sorely mistaken. I'm part of a family with more resources than you could imagine. His eyes widened, but he quickly regained composure. So you think you're some big shot, huh? Charming sisters, playing the role of the hero, but without me, you won't find Mackenzie in time. I leaned forward, giving him a hard look. Now that I know you've got money, you want me to pay you $500,000 if I want to talk to Mackenzie. You're really trying to manipulate me with my own daughter. Stephen's face twisted in bitterness. Not really. Mackenzie was just a tool for Carol and me. I never cared about her. She was just in the way, always crying about her dad. I don't care if she lives or dies. I shook my head, disgusted. That's how it is, huh? Well, I'll tell you this. I'm not going to play your game, so you can keep your demands. By the time you tell me where she is, it'll be too late. He crossed his arms defiantly. That's right. You'll pay me, or Mackenzie is gone. I met his eyes, unwavering. You're not in control here anymore. In the midst of our small but spirited exchange, I raised both my arms, signaling the moment for Melody and Harmony to step back quickly. Without hesitation, Mackenzie settled into my lap. She looked at the screen and smirked. I don't think you'll get anything from me, but thanks for the entertaining story for my birthday. This one will definitely be one we laugh about for years, about how you tried to blackmail me. There was nothing left for him to say, so I continued. Now, let's talk about the real facts since your lies don't stand a chance. I paused, ensuring my words struck deep. I know all about your divorce with Carol. I know the love you think you get from some guy in the showers, but that won't change anytime soon, and I've learned the truth about what you both did to my daughter. I leaned down to kiss Mackenzie on the cheek, feeling the warmth of her presence. I now have 5 wonderful children, and Mackenzie's cancer treatment is progressing well. She's not in remission yet, but we are hopeful. With a bone marrow transplant, blood transfusions, and new chemotherapy drugs, we are doing everything we can to make things right. Turning to Mackenzie, I smiled. Hey, Pumpkin, I know this guy's your father. Do you want to say anything to him? Mackenzie glanced at me, kissed my cheek, and giggled. Thanks, Daddy, she said before turning her attention back to the screen. You listen here, jerk, she began, her voice filled with a new strength. You and your partner used me, a confused teenager, in your scheme to tear apart my family. I get it, you're rude, with fewer manners than a drunken wild animal. Yes, I'm aware you're not impressive, but don't think for a second I didn't hear everything you just said. I've spent the last few months asking my real father for forgiveness for what I did to him, so don't call, don't write, and never try to reach out to me again. I hope my dad Terry can forgive me one day, but I never want to see you again, because if I do, you'll regret it, you terrible person. Now go back to your cell and be miserable. With that, she stood up, walked away, her breath a little shaky, her body trembling from the emotions of the moment. Melody, Harmony, and I watched her leave, and then, without a word, we turned back to the screen. All 3 of us flipped him the bird with wide grins before ending the call. Happy birthday to me, I muttered under my breath, a bit of satisfaction in my voice. A few days later, Mackenzie celebrated her own birthday, falling on a weekend. We organized a family BBQ, a joyful gathering that included Dad, Paul, Kim, and the kids. I had invited Carol too, but with a stern warning to behave. After all that had come to light, I knew things were different now. I had to talk Mackenzie down from calling her mother to cancel her attendance, promising that if Carol caused any trouble, we'd ask her to leave. While I wasn't thrilled by Mackenzie's deteriorating relationship with her mother, I wasn't surprised either. Over the past few months, we discovered that Carol was far more manipulative than we had ever realized. To our surprise, a guest neither Mackenzie nor I expected arrived that day, Mackenzie's old boyfriend, Ben. Mackenzie had met Ben about a year ago at university. They were inseparable from the start, but when Mackenzie's illness forced her to leave her studies, she broke up with him, convinced he deserved better than a girlfriend who was so sick she might not live much longer. I hadn't heard much about Ben after that, but I knew Mackenzie had cared deeply for him. It was clear from the sadness in her eyes when she let him go. So, when he walked through the door, she was caught off guard. He had been trying to reach Carol for months, but Carol, frustrated, had finally told him Mackenzie was living with her biological father, the owner of Deo's Inc. down in BST Half-Truth. But it sounded convincing. Ben had done some digging and somehow found his way to Melody. It was then that my wives began to realize that Melody was almost as much a victim of Carol as I was. Upon hearing Ben's story, Melody quickly invited him to spend the weekend with us. When Mackenzie saw Ben, she dropped her glass on the lawn, rushing to him. They embraced, tears streaming down their faces. For the rest of the day, she hardly let go of his hand, except to give someone else a hug or show him something. Mackenzie looked so happy, but Carol didn't seem pleased in the slightest. That day, two things stood out. The first was when Mackenzie began opening her presents. My wives had taken her shopping earlier in the morning, giving her a fresh wardrobe to replace the worn-out, outdated designer clothes. There was no need for flashy brand names anymore. Mackenzie looked great without them. William and Martha bought her a new iPad with a keyboard and promised to help her get back to studying. Dad got her a new laptop for the same purpose. Kim embraced Mackenzie with a big kiss, happy to have her back in the family, and handed her 3 special bottles of rum Bundy Bean, Lee, and Kraken. Later, I pulled Kim aside and asked if she was crying. She claimed her allergies were acting up because of the pollen, but I could tell she was simply overwhelmed with joy that Mackenzie was home. As Mackenzie opened her gifts, I had 3 special ones for her. The first was a nice journal with a fancy pen. I told her it was for her journey through cancer, for her to write down her thoughts and feelings, both good and bad, so that one day, when she beat the illness, she could look back and celebrate it. Everyone gathered around, admiring the gift. The second was a gift wrapped in slightly torn and faded paper. When Mackenzie opened it, both of us started to cry. The card inside depicted cartoon teenagers at a party with the words, "Party on" and "Happy Birthday." I had written a heartfelt message. "My dearest Mackenzie, I miss you so much, and I don't know if you'll ever see this, but please come back to me. I love you so much, Pumpkin. Love, Dad. Your real Dad." I had been in a dark place when I wrote that card, but it expressed what I felt deep down. Mackenzie dropped the card and hugged me tightly, whispering how sorry she was. A few moments later, Mackenzie opened the third gift. A new set of sleepwear, a cozy oversized t-shirt, and a very expensive scientific calculator she had wanted for months. At over $300, it had taken a long time to save for it, but she loved it, even though most people used smartphones for math nowadays. The calculator found a place of honor on her desk. The final gift I gave her was a simple manila envelope. Inside was a document stating that Mackenzie's adoption by Stephen Morrison was cancelled. If she signed the paper and had it witnessed, she would once again be Mackenzie Other, daughter of Terry Other and Carol Brown. I held my daughter close as she cried, but this time the tears were happy ones. After nearly 10 years, I had my daughter back. As the party began to wind down, I couldn't help but feel like we had just taken a huge step toward healing. I had a brief conversation with Carol as people started heading inside. Mackenzie was giving Ben a tour of the house, likely showing him her room too. My dad and I wanted to intervene, but Mackenzie was no longer a teenager. She was in her 20s now, and I couldn't control her time with her boyfriend. Meanwhile, my other daughters took the kids inside with Kim to give them baths and set up a movie. Paul and Dad were cleaning the grill while I picked up the trash before heading inside. Just as I tossed the last bag into the bin, I saw Carol standing there. "I hope you're happy, Terry," she said, hands on her hips, eyes locked onto mine. It had been a while since I'd last seen her, and honestly, she didn't look much better. She reminded me of a potato with arms and legs almost like a Mr. Potato Head. "Well, Carol, there's a lot making me happy these days. Today, for example, has been wonderful. The weather's lovely, and we're celebrating our daughter's birthday. Is there something specific you want me to be happy about?" I asked, trying to stay calm. She threw her hands up in frustration and turned to walk away. I quickly followed her, catching up with her on the back deck. "Carol, You can't just say something like that and walk off. Of course I can, Terry, she snapped, turning to face me. You've never understood me, not after all these years. I frowned. Understand what, Carol? I don't have a clue what you mean. Just say it. Yes, I'm happy, I said, feeling annoyed. I didn't want her here, but I was doing this for Mackenzie. She glared at me, visibly upset, before slumping into a chair on the patio. Terry, for 15 years you've been my support, my safe place. I took you for granted. You never questioned my small decisions. You did whatever you could for me. She looked up at me as I sat across from her. When we were 18, we had Mackenzie. After that, all I had was Mackenzie and you. I grew so unhappy, I thought there was something better waiting for me everywhere except where I was. I nodded, still unsure of where this was going. I always pushed you, taking whatever I wanted because I thought I deserved more. I was married to a plumber. She laughed bitterly. My friends were married to important people consultants, lawyers, and I was just the wife of the plumber. No one said anything, but I know they judged me. There goes Carol, married to that plumber guy. She paused, looking down at her arm. I waited for 15 years, taking what I could from you without going too far. But then, Stephen came along. I raised an eyebrow. Stephen? Yes, she continued. He impressed me with his money and success. He was so confident. When he noticed I wasn't happy, it didn't take much to win me over. But he was terrible when it came to being close. Still, his money and status made up for it. My friends started seeing me as someone important, not just as the plumber's wife. She stopped, clearly thinking. Then, her expression hardened with anger. But you had to ruin everything. I was taken aback. What do you mean? If you hadn't gone to the hospital that night and given Mackenzie's money to me like I asked, I would still have Stephen's wealth and everything that came with it. She spat, voice rising. I leaned back, stunned. I had expected some kind of apology, but it wasn't coming. Carol stood up and began pacing. Stephen and I were happy, Terry. We were happy. You would have been forgotten in a few years, and Mackenzie would have come around and learned to love him. We could have been a happy family, and you just had to interfere. No, Terry, you listen to me for once, she continued, her voice growing louder. You ruined my life. You never did what I wanted. You always did what you thought was right, but you never did what I needed. Her voice was a sharp, desperate plea. And now you're here with those two women. She pointed at me with fury. You have everything. You've got this huge house, more money than I can count, and people respect you, while I'm ignored. I'm stuck with nothing. Are you done, Carol? I asked, my arms crossed, anger rising in me as well. Not even close. You've messed up my life, Terry. You always put me down, and now it's my turn. She was shouting now, her face red with rage. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My family had invited Carol here, and now she was yelling at me in my own home about the happiness I had found with Harmony and Melody, even after she had pushed me away. Before I could say anything, I was interrupted. Hey, you! Melody shouted. Neither of us had noticed that she and Harmony had come up behind me, standing a few steps back, their expressions protective. Mackenzie appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide with anger. As soon as we saw them, my girls stepped forward. First, Harmony slapped Carol hard across the face, and then Melody hit her on the other side. Before Carol could even react, Melody snapped, You're awful. After everything you've done to our family, Terry convinced Mackenzie to let you come here for her birthday. No one likes you, and we want you to leave. We're being nice because your daughter is living with us while our husband helps her, Harmony added. It's her special day, but here you are, acting like you're better than everyone, screaming at our husband and calling us names. Carol stood there, shocked, glancing between them. I crossed my arms and watched, a smirk creeping onto my face. Well, about that last part, you've got a point, Melody said with a grin. We may have our flaws, but we're Terry's. Did you know he can make me feel things I didn't even know were possible? Carol looked taken aback. And you've really upset us, Harmony continued, her voice steely. Your self-righteous act doesn't fool anyone. Your so-called friends never respected you, and now you've lost everything. The tension in the air was thick as Carol's words cut through the room, sharp and deliberate. You think just because your husband is a plumber, we care. You act like you're something special, but you're not, she sneered, the bitterness in her voice unmistakable. You walk around like you're entitled to everything. But the truth is, you have nothing, and it's all because of you. You blame Terry for everything, but can you honestly point to one moment when he was the problem? Every single fight, every wound he suffered, it's all been a result of the choices you made. Melody, her face hardening with conviction, stepped in, her voice a clear echo of her mother's accusation. That's right, she said, her words venomous. You can't even see it, can you? You're the one causing all the chaos, not Terry. He never wanted any of this. All he ever did was try to keep the peace, but you couldn't let it go." She took a deep breath, adding with a bitterness that felt like ice in the air, "He never wanted revenge. But you never forgave him, never let go of the past, and now we're all suffering because of your refusal to move on." I could see Mackenzie, her face a mask of disappointment, stepping forward and standing by my side. "She's right, Mom," she said quietly. "Since the day we pushed Dad away, we've been the ones reaching out to him. He never came looking for us, and I regret pushing him away. I'm just grateful he's let me back into his life, especially today of all days." Her words softened, a smile curving her lips as she continued. "Dad saved my life, Mum. He gave part of himself to help me fight cancer. He's always been there, even when we turned him away. When those two women were trapped in a sinking car, he risked his own life to save them and hurt himself in the process. Not because he wanted anything in return, but because he's a good man. He's the most loving, caring man I know, and that's why he deserves to be loved by more than one person. He deserves to have 2 wives, so his love never goes to waste." Carol's face twisted in agony, and her voice cracked. "He took everything from me, everything," she cried. "And you're all just letting him get away with it." Mackenzie stood firm, her words sharp as ever. "No, Mum, it was you who took everything from us. Dad never sought revenge. You just couldn't let go. You couldn't forgive him. And because of that, everything we went through was our doing, not his." The anger, the sadness, the years of hurt, all came spilling out in that moment. But Mackenzie wasn't done. "And while we're on the subject, let's talk about how you treated me. You always took his side, betrayed me in front of him, pushed me to do what he wanted. I was your daughter, and yet you never stood up for me." Carol stood there, silent, the weight of Mackenzie's words sinking in. My daughters were glaring at her, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and disappointment. Mackenzie was hurt, and I could see it. But she was stronger now. She didn't need to keep fighting. With a heavy sigh, Mackenzie turned to Carol. "Mum, it was kind of the family to invite you here today for my birthday, but honestly, you've overstayed your welcome." Carol's eyes widened in shock. "Are you kicking me out?" she asked, her voice trembling. I stepped forward, my voice steady, unwavering. "Yes, Carol," I said. "You've overstayed your welcome today, and I want you to know that you're not welcome here anymore. If our daughter wants to see you, she can meet you elsewhere, but not here. Not again." The room was silent as I turned and led Carol to the door. I helped her gather her things, her coat, her purse. I walked her out to her car, my hand firmly on her arm until the car door was open. Before she could speak, I leaned in and kissed her gently on the cheek. "Carol," I said softly, "it's time for you to move on. Stop trying to come back into our lives. We've moved on. It's time you did the same." Her voice wavered as she tried to protest. "But Terry, you can't." "Oh, but I can," I said, cutting her off. "This is my family's home now, and right now you're not welcome here. If you've got an issue, talk to my lawyer. You know her. She's been watching you from the window. She's my sister, and like my wives and children, she loves me. If I asked her to, she wouldn't hesitate to protect me, so it's best for you to go." Turning back toward the house, I could feel the strength of my family at my back. My wives stood by me, silent but strong. My 4 children, holding hands, looked on, each of them holding their own thoughts but unified in the support they had for me. Mackenzie, holding Ben's hand, gave me a small but genuine smile. Ben didn't say much, but I could tell from the way he stood by Mackenzie that he was there for her, no matter what. I looked over at Paul and Kim, who stood with their 3 kids behind them, and there, at the edge of the group, stood my father, John. I had been through so much in the past 8 years, lost so much, but with these people around me I realized just how much I had gained, how much love and support they had given me when I thought I'd lost everything. For a moment, I watched Carol drive away, the sight of her retreating into the distance almost surreal. My youngest son, Adam, came running up to me. "Is that mean lady leaving?" he asked, his voice filled with innocent relief. I ruffled his hair, smiling softly. "Yes, Adam, she's gone, and I don't think she's coming back." "Good," he said, running back inside with the other kids. I heard my dad shout from inside, "Ice cream for dessert," and the lightness of the moment lifted my heart. Mackenzie, standing beside me, spoke again. "Dad, Ben's going to stay the night, okay?" "Sure, we can put him in one of the spare rooms," I said, but Mackenzie shook her head. "No, Dad, he's staying in my room." Her voice wasn't asking for permission, it was a statement. I was taken aback for a moment. My daughter, now an adult, wanted her boyfriend to stay in her room on her birthday. I could see the smile on her face, but my heart was heavy with mixed feelings. The house was alive with laughter as Melody and Harmony giggled at my reaction. "Sounds great, sweetie," Melody said with a grin. "Happy birthday," I replied, though my voice carried a bittersweet note. She might be 23, an adult in her own right, but she would always be my daughter. The thought lingered with me as my wives wrapped their arms around me. Melody whispered softly in my ear, kissing my neck. "It's okay, baby. She's just figuring things out. She's a smart girl, and you won't be a grandfather anytime soon," she chuckled. Harmony added her own laugh, a light-heartedness that only a sister could share. As I held both my wives close, my gaze drifted back to Carol's car. But then, I felt the warmth of the love surrounding me, and it was enough to pull my thoughts away from the past. Carol would never understand the kind of love we shared, the kind that transcended all the hurt, the past, and the mistakes. A love built on understanding, patience, and giving. As I watched her drive away, I knew that our family was finally free to move forward, free to heal. Inside the house, I could hear the sounds of celebration laughter, music, joy. Mackenzie's laughter stood out, filling me with pride. The circle of my family gathered around the birthday cake singing. Life was good. But then, 5 years later, a letter arrived in the mail. It had been there for a week, but she hadn't opened it yet. She was too scared. In the evening, after another day of managing the mundane chaos that was her life, Carol finally arrived home. Her small apartment, located just a short walk from her job, greeted her with its familiar warmth. She tossed her bag onto the couch as though it weighed more than the world itself, before shuffling to her tiny kitchen. There she reheated leftovers, nothing special, but enough to quiet the gnawing hunger. A modest glass of cheap red wine accompanied her meal, though it didn't quite match the taste of the food. Still, it was all she could afford. She sank back into the couch, her body reminding her of the injury from 4 years ago. The limp was persistent, and there were days when she couldn't walk without a cane. The extra weight she'd gained from eating too much and wallowing in her sadness didn't help either. As the news played in the background, Carol picked at her plain dinner. Each bite tasted bitter, not because of the food, but because of what it represented: another day of surviving, not living. She sighed deeply, and, in an absent-minded motion, set her bowl down on the side table. Her fingers brushed against an envelope lying there, and instinctively she recoiled, as if it were an object ready to sting her. She stared at it for a long moment before reluctantly reaching for it. Her fingers, swollen from the years of neglect and pain, struggled to peel back the envelope. The handwriting inside was untidy, the kind of scrawl that only someone who worked with their hands would write. Still, there was something oddly comforting about the simplicity of it, even if the words were imperfect. With a sip of wine to steady herself, Carol began to read. "Carol, I hope this letter finds you in better health than when we last saw each other. I pray your injuries have healed, and you've found some peace after everything that has happened. I wasn't pleased with how things went, but I can't blame you for what your ex-husband did. Who would have guessed he'd be on work release that day? But he's gone now, and you've had to face the consequences of your actions. All I ever wanted was for both of us to be there for Mackenzie's final treat. I thought it would be a gesture of kindness to invite you. You may not have been my favorite person for a long time, but you were there at the start of our daughter's cancer journey, and I wanted you to be there at the end. Unfortunately, things spiraled out of control. It took Harmony almost a year to walk again after you and your ex-husband hurt her. She's nearly fully healed now, though her leg still aches when the weather turns cold. You're lucky your ex-husband died that day. If he hadn't, I believe his actions would have landed you in jail too. Speaking of which, what were you thinking? Everyone knows I would never have been involved with you, as you told Harmony, and she knew that. Just so you know, Melody's hand has healed from the gunshot wound she suffered when your ex-husband tried to harm us all. Carol, none of us can forgive you for what you did. My love for my wives has only grown stronger each day. Their love saved both me and Mackenzie on a difficult day. I think of you sometimes, but mostly with anger, because of the pain you've caused. Mackenzie asked me to write this to you. She said I should be honest, so here it is. Mackenzie has made me so proud. She beat cancer, earned her degree, married Ben, and just had their first child. Can you believe we're grandparents now? Mackenzie and I talk about you often, but she hasn't reached out because she feels hurt and embarrassed by you. After he passed, she found it hard to continue being your daughter. I tried to tell you many times that you needed to care for others, to show kindness and respect, to understand real love, but you never did. Because of that, you've lost your daughter, her husband, and our new grandchild. I'm sending you some pictures of Mackenzie, Ben, and little Jordan. He's full of life, with big brown eyes and strong hands. Mackenzie jokes he'll grow up to be a plumber like his grandfather. I'm not sure about that, but I'll support him in whatever he chooses. Don't expect to be invited to any birthdays or baby showers. There's little love for you in our family. I feel this way because I don't have good things to say about you. I wish I could feel differently, but I'll always carry the anger for the pain you caused. Just to be clear, this is all on you. You caused this from the moment you cheated. It's time for you to pick yourself up, Carol. No one who once loved you cares what happens to you now. Maybe, in a few years, if things change, I'll write again. But for now, we don't want any contact with you. Please don't write back. Take care. Terry, your ex-husband. Carol read the letter 3 times as though it could somehow make the words hurt less, but each pass only made the sting deeper. With a heavy heart, she folded the letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope. She made her way to her small bedroom, where a box of keepsakes sat untouched. She added the letter to the collection, which contained old photographs, memories of her and Terry during happier times. There were images of their vacations, their laughter echoing in places like Bali, and others of her, pregnant with Mackenzie, glowing with the promise of a family she had thought would last forever. One photo showed Terry at a job site, in his work clothes, strong and proud of the life he was building for them. Carol's fingers lingered on the photo, a sadness creeping into her chest. She had lost so much, nearly everything, because she hadn't understood that what she had with Terry was real love. Tears welled in her eyes as she stared at the image of young Terry, so strong and full of hope, standing beside her. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the photo. But as the tears flowed, she felt the weight of her solitude. No one noticed, no one cared. As she closed the box, the silence of the room enveloped her once more, leaving her alone with her regret and the quiet hum of an empty life.
Hey there. Love a good story? The kind that pulls you in, keeps you on the edge of your seat, and leaves you wanting more? Well, you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button and tap the OYO notification bell so you never miss another epic story. Trust me, the best ones are still to come. New stories, more twists, bigger surprises. Be the first to hear them. You don't want to be the last to know. So go ahead, smash that button, and let's dive into the next great story together.